Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. The US pledges to prevent ISIS from re-establishing itself in Syria. Meanwhile, Antony Blinken continues talks in the Middle East, visiting Jordan and Turkey in his final days as Secretary of State. Originally mistaken for missing US journalist Austin Tice, this American prisoner talks exclusively to Al Arabiya. And FBI Director Chris Wray says he will step down from the role in January at the end of Biden's administration. To our top story, and the United States is expressing cautious optimism for the future of Syria, free from former President Bashar Al-Assad. But while many Syrians are celebrating, the Pentagon is trying to carve out a strategy that prevents a resurgence of ISIS in the country. Nick Harper reports from Washington.
The celebrations for the fall of a government and a return to life after 13 years of brutal civil war. For others, the end of Bashar Al-Assad's government means a return home. Thousands of exiles have poured into the country over the past few days.
The war is over and we're returning to the country, to our homeland, where we'll live with ease. It's what we need. It's in God's hands now.
The US is determined that the current safety remains. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says Washington wants to ensure the Islamic State doesn't regain a foothold in Syria. In a phone call with his Israeli counterpart, Israel Katz, Austin promised no safe haven for the group. The Pentagon says US prisons in the country holding ISIS detainees remain under the control of the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces. But the SDF has reported attacks on those facilities. In the past few days, the US and Israel have carried out hundreds of airstrikes on parts of Syria, including on ISIS targets, with Israeli troops conducting military operations along its border with Syria. Hundreds of political prisoners have been freed since the fall of the Syrian government. Some families are still searching for their loved ones, but it's raising hope in the US that journalist Austin Tice could now be found. His parents have campaigned for more than a decade to bring him home after he was abducted in 2012 while reporting in Damascus. US President Joe Biden has said he believes Tice is alive, but his exact location is still unclear.
Finding Austin Tice is a top priority of this administration. The FBI and State Department have offered up to $11 million in reward to anyone who can provide information. We do not know where he is located. We do not know.
The years of darkness of the Assad regime have now passed, but the days ahead are still uncertain. The US is making it clear there are potential dangers in that uncertainty, with all the unknowns of what comes next, how the country is governed. The Biden administration says it supports a peaceful, inclusive political transition, but it knows that comes with the need of maintaining strong counter-terrorism connections. Nick Harper, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
An American man imprisoned in Syria who was reportedly first identified as the missing US journalist Austin Tice has spoken exclusively to Al Arabiya today. The man, who says his name is Travis, allegedly crossed into Syria from Lebanon and was imprisoned for 7 months. Here's what he had to say.
They thought that you're Austin Tice first. Did you know about the case of Austin Tice before you were imprisoned?
No.
No. Because he's been imprisoned for 12 years. You've never heard of that?
No.
And what's your work? What did you do? Why did you enter Syria?
I came on a religious pilgrimage.
Uh-huh.
I'm a Christian.
And how did they treat you in the prison?
Well, it was okay. I was fed, I was watered. The one difficulty was that I couldn't go to the bathroom when I wanted to. And so I had to wait on that. I was only let out 3 times a day to go to the bathroom. Other than that, I was not beaten, and the guards treated me decently.
Mm-hmm. Did you hear any kinds of any kind of torture voices in the prison?
Yes.
Let's speak to the journalist responsible for that video, Al Arabiya's own correspondent, Taher Baraka, who joins us. He is live in Damascus. Taher, you have been at Sidnaya prison speaking to the American prisoner. Who was he and what did he tell you?
Thank you for having me. So what happened actually that he was in the house after he was released. The place that we went to was the house that he was took into when some villagers in that area, in the suburbs of Damascus, which is Al-Dibyaniya, saw him walking on the street. So they took him into this house where I went to after like lots of calls and lots of trials. We've been able to reach that house. I think all the press in Syria was crying. Even journalists, colleagues from Syria and abroad to reach him. But finally, we could be the first Arabic channel to reach there and the first channel at all to reach that house and talk to him. Actually, you know, all the villagers were there. They were trying to protect him. They were trying to talk to him. They fed him. They gave him some tea and water so that he can be able to talk. And when I arrived, I told him I myself was believed that he might be Austin Tice. I know Austin Tice and the pictures and the photos that I've seen for him for 12 years covering this issue from the headquarters. But I thought maybe the prison, maybe I was under the, you know, under the sudden we went there. We were overwhelmed by the story. So I told him, they said, you're Austin Tice. He said, no, I'm not Austin Tice. I told him, do you know about Austin Tice's case? Have you ever heard of it? He said, no, I know nothing about Austin Tice. I was imprisoned for 7 months in the Far'a Palestine, which is very famous in the negative way, indeed, in Syria and in the Arab world for the torture that takes place there for the prisoners from their guards. I asked him about his guards and how did they treat him in the prison. He said they treated me well, but they used to let me go to the bathroom for 3 times only during the day. And they used to bring me some water and some bread and maybe some kinds of vegetables only, maybe cabbage, he said. So just to keep him alive, I believe. But he wasn't tortured, as he told me, but he was for 3 continuous months. The last 3 months, it was in the dark. He was not allowed to go out of his cell. The first 4 months, he was allowed to go in the sun. But the last 3 months, he was not allowed to go. I asked him about his family. He talked to them. He said, no, they didn't even know that I'm coming to Syria. When I crossed the borders from Lebanon, I was intending to visit some Christian sites for pilgrimage. So he's very religious, as he seems, and he told me that I want to go to Jordan. I asked him, are you going to the States now? He said, no, I want to go to Jordan to visit the Christian sites as well. So he looked safe. He looked okay. And they told me that they brought a doctor to him, and he said he's okay, no other problems. And then some of the official government came to that house and took him out. I don't know much about his whereabouts right now until we hear a word from the American officials about where he's going to be in the coming days.
Al Arabiya correspondent Taher Baraka, thank you so much for joining us. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has arrived in the Middle East for his final tour of the Biden administration. Blinken will be focusing on the Gaza ceasefire and hostage deal, as well as a transition in Syria following the fall of Assad's government. He will have talks in Turkey tomorrow after being in Jordan today. The State Department have said the tour is intended to reiterate the United States' support for an inclusive Syrian-led transition to an accountable and representative government. We can now speak to Sinan Ulgan, former Turkish diplomat and now the director of the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies in Istanbul. Sinan, thank you so much for joining us. So Blinken is on his 11th trip to the region. He's expected to meet Turkish officials tomorrow. What will likely be on the agenda?
Well, a couple of core issues. The first one that you mentioned, namely how can Turkey and the United States cooperate to ensure that Syria heads towards a future of political stability. Secondly, on the Turkish side, one of the big issues will be to essentially negotiate with the United States about the future role of the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF. And thirdly, Turkey will also ask the US to support an international effort to concentrate international funding for the economic reconstruction of Syria. So those are essentially the three main themes that, the foreign ministers will discuss.
The Turkish intelligence chief is reportedly in Damascus, and there are reports of a 4-day ceasefire being implemented between Turkish-backed forces and the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. Could these 4 days be used for a more comprehensive agreement to end the fighting long term?
Well, obviously they could, but, the comprehensive agreement will not be concluded in 4 days. The complexities are very substantive, and so far the expectations have also not been convergent. So this would be a first step indeed, but the handicap to some extent is the fact that this is an outgoing US administration. So there's really a limit to how much commitment the U.S. can take and how credible that commitment would be, given that in around a month, Turkey will need to deal with a different U.S. administration whose position on Syria may certainly be different.
Turkey retains a presence in Syria, and Israel is trying to gain a foothold in the country. Are they competing for influence and territory?
No, geographically, we're speaking about, very different regions of Syria, so they're certainly not competing in geographical terms. However, there may indeed be a degree of competition in terms of future influence over the administrative setup in Damascus. Namely, which country will have more influence over the transitional government. Obviously, as things stand, Turkey has a clear advantage, given that it has supported one of the core components of that being the Syrian National Army, but also has, contacts with the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And in that sense, there is obviously more weight that Ankara brings to the table. And this is obviously very visible with now the diplomatic traffic that is witnessed in Ankara with Tony Blinken, but also von der Leyen from the EU will also be in Ankara in about 2 days.
Looking at all the dynamics on the ground in Syria, which shares a long land border with Turkey, what is Ankara's desired outcome?
Well, Ankara's desired outcome is a Syrian state that remains unitary in nature, that has consolidated its territorial integrity, and that can provide security and economic prosperity to its citizens and control its borders. That's what Ankara wants. Now, whether this is achievable under current circumstances, that's essentially going to be up to Syria's own political stakeholders. But Turkey will seemingly make every effort so that this transition succeeds politically and economically, so that Syria becomes a valuable and prosperous neighbor to Turkey. That's what's in Turkey's interest.
Sinan Ulgan, former Turkish diplomat and now the director of the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
The director of the FBI, Chris Wray, has said he will resign at the end of the Biden administration in January. Wray, who has been in the role since 2017 and still has 3 years remaining of his 10-year term, was likely to be forced out by President-elect Trump, who has nominated former federal prosecutor Kash Patel for the job. But it's left many at the FBI feeling concerned about Wray's replacement and whether that person will be able to separate themselves from politics.
How's the feedback so far?
Let's get the reaction from Washington now with our correspondent, Benji. Hiya, Benji. Thank you so much for joining us. Was this inevitable, considering Trump's pick for FBI director has already been announced?
Yeah, it's not a surprise because Christopher Wray, perhaps unsurprisingly, doesn't want to become the third FBI chief to be fired by a president, and that is what probably would have happened had he remained in post into Donald Trump's administration. The president-elect making no secret about his feelings towards the current FBI makeup, the Justice Department, which he sees as being weaponized, and his intent to replace independents like Christopher Wray with more loyal appointees. For example, Kash Patel, who you mentioned, the former Justice Department lawyer. He has in recent weeks mirrored Donald Trump's aspiration for retribution against his political adversaries, individuals that Donald Trump calls, quote, the enemies within. Patel also saying he wants to empty the FBI HQ and deal with what he refers to as the deep state. Incidentally, Christopher Wray was one of Donald Trump's own appointees. He was put into the position to head the bureau after then-President Donald Trump fired James Comey. That inspired that investigation, you might remember, into whether Trump won the 2016 election due to the assistance of Russian interference. Christopher Wray has spoken wistfully about his time at the FBI, but he oversaw a very tumultuous period. Investigations into Donald Trump, 2 of them, that obviously contributed towards the way that the president-elect feels about the Justice Department, and of those assassination attempts, 2 of them, into the president-elect as well during this most recent election campaign. Wray saying that there is no time for complacency or distraction, a message that he wants to see continued, taken on, I should say, by his successor and staff at the agency. But Donald Trump has reacted gleefully to the news of Christopher Wray's resignation, the most high profile ahead of Trump's inauguration, the president-elect saying that this is a, quote, great day for America.
So we've heard from Trump, but how has the Capitol responded to Wray's resignation, Benji?
Well, I think that there was a realization, a kind of resignation from those within the Biden administration that this would ultimately happen. There was some hope within Biden circles that Christopher Wray would stay on, almost as an act of defiance, only then ultimately to be fired by Donald Trump, as opposed to resigning early and giving in to what many Trump critics see as, an authoritarian force. But, whether it happened now or down the line, it was unlikely due to the way that Donald Trump feels about Christopher Wray and his investigations into him, both that one related to the alleged efforts to overturn the previous election, the mishandling of classified documents as well, both, cases that will now be likely consigned to the dustbin of history given Donald Trump has won the election. Because of those actions, Donald Trump has been massively disparaging about Christopher Wray, and so his time, was limited, even though there are still many years to go until the end of his term. I think there is now concern amongst the Biden administration and many within the FBI about what comes next for the agency under Kash Patel if he is approved, that is, by Congress. And that is not necessarily a guarantee, given his controversial plans for the agency that I mentioned before about how he effectively wants to completely revamp the way that it works, send out thousands of employees from the Bureau to the streets as well, and of course seek revenge against Donald Trump's political opponents, even if they haven't committed a crime.
And finally, just in 60 seconds, tell me, Donald Trump has been named Time magazine's Person of the Year for a second time. That's after surviving 2 assassination attempts. What has the reaction been like in Washington to this news?
Well, he said that he's honoured, which is an interesting one because often those on the front page of Time magazine are not put there as an endorsement. You know, there have been many figures from history that the Time magazine doesn't want to endorse, but still puts on the front page. Donald Trump now featuring for a second time. I think if you look at precedent, what often happens is if someone wins a US election, they tend to find themselves on the front cover. So had Harris won, she would have likely been the figure. Instead, Donald Trump, of course. He says he's honoured and he's tried to use the day to promote himself in New York. I mean, in terms of the reaction here, I'm not sure the Biden administration is paying that much attention, frankly, to Donald Trump, but they may pay attention to the comments that he made in the Time magazine interview where he reiterated his willingness to pardon those that partook in the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, that insurrection attempt to try to overturn the 2020 election that Trump lost to Joe Biden.
Benji Haya in Washington, thank you. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the news today. South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol has defended his shock decision to declare martial law last week. In a surprise TV address today, he said the attempt was a legal decision to protect the country's democracy. Yoon has also suggested that he would not step down ahead of a second vote to impeach him in Parliament on Saturday. The US has warned that Russia may use its new intermediate-range ballistic missile against Ukraine again. According to the Pentagon, an intelligence assessment suggests an attack could be carried out in the coming days. It comes as both sides battle for military advantage ahead of negotiations to end the 3-year war. Children as young as 10 will face adult jail time in the Australian state of Queensland if convicted of crimes such as murder, serious assault and break-ins. The government says the new laws will reduce youth crime and act as a deterrent, but experts argue evidence suggests otherwise. The United Nations has also criticised the reforms. Bird flu antibodies have been discovered in horse blood samples in Mongolia. It's feared all horses could be at risk in areas where bird flu is prevalent and could pass the virus on to humans. The threat of the H5N1 virus could become the likely cause of a future pandemic. Mark Zuckerberg's firm Meta has donated $1 million to Donald Trump's inauguration fund. That's as the Facebook founder tries to mend ties with the president-elect. In August, Trump threatened to imprison the billionaire if he did anything illegal to influence the presidential election. Staying with Trump, and the US president-elect has invited Chinese President Xi Jinping to attend his inauguration next month. This could be a signal that Trump wants to court his Chinese counterpart just as he threatens fresh tariffs. But it was not clear if it had been accepted. It comes as the Kremlin reveals it has not received an invitation for the Russian President Vladimir Putin to attend the ceremony on the 20th of January. Laura Westbrook reports.
Well, Donald Trump invited Chinese President Xi Jinping in early November, shortly after winning the U.S. presidential election, according to reports. And he said in an interview last week that he had been in communication with Xi Jinping recently, but he declined to say what they had discussed. No Chinese leader has ever attended a U.S. presidential inauguration. Indeed, no foreign leaders have attended one in more than a century. However, it is common for foreign dignitaries and diplomats to attend, and this is also a practice that Beijing has adopted. And this comes as the U.S. and China brace for a renewed standoff after Trump campaigned on a promise to implement 60% tariffs for all goods imported from China. And last month, he vowed to impose an additional 10% tariff on Chinese goods unless Beijing does more to stop the flow of illegal drugs, particularly fentanyl. And Trump has also tapped a number of China hawks to lead the economic and security portfolios in his incoming administration. And according to reports, the president-elect does put a lot on leader-to-leader relationships to help him make deals and to advance his agenda. And so this invitation could be seen as an olive branch from Trump. However, analysts here say it would be very unlikely that Xi Jinping accepts, with very little upside for him. And separately on Wednesday, in written remarks to the U.S.-China Business Council, Xi Jinping said that Beijing is prepared to stay in communication with the U.S., and he also called for market openness from both countries, and that very much is aimed at those Trump tariffs.
Our correspondent there, Laura Westbrook in Hong Kong. Thank you for joining us. Let's take a look at some of the top business news now. And many small firms in Britain say they have stopped selling goods to Northern Ireland and Europe because of new EU customs rules brought on by leaving the European Union. Many businesses said they were unable to meet the new paperwork requirements. A recent YouGov poll shows the majority of so-called Brexit voters would now accept a return to free movement in exchange for access to the single market. The Australian government has said it will create new rules to force big tech companies to pay local publishers for their news content. The decision came from a previous law passed by Australia back in 2021 and affects big tech giants like Meta and Google. Turning to sport now. The New York Mets has signed Juan Soto, considered to be one of the season's best hitters from rival team, the New York Yankees. Soto is reported to have signed a 15-year contract worth $765 million. And Max Verstappen has thanked Formula E for donating $250,000 to charity after the driver lost out on his fourth successive F1 title. The Formula E boss made the wager in February after he argued the F1 was too predictable in comparison to his series. The cash will be split between Red Bull's Wings for Life Foundation, a new fund to provide greater opportunities for women in sport. A reminder of our top stories. The US pledges to prevent ISIS from re-establishing itself in Syria. Meanwhile, Antony Blinken continues talks in the Middle East, visiting Jordan and Turkey in his final days as Secretary of State. Originally mistaken for missing US journalist Austin Tice, this American prisoner talks exclusively to Al Arabiya. And FBI Director Chris Wray says he will step down from the role in January at the end of Biden's administration. And that's all from us on W News. Thanks for joining us. Hadley Gamble is coming up next. And don't miss Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night.
Just days after America's chaotic and deadly withdrawal from Afghanistan, a daring film crew embedded themselves with the Taliban, capturing a story the world has never seen before. Over the course of the year, they documented the shocking realities of a group totally unprepared for power, but wielding billions of dollars in abandoned U.S. military hardware.
Odessa Ray, thank you so much for joining Al Arabiya. I want to kick off by asking you what brought you to this project.
In those first days after the U.S. pullout, they were quite euphoric and sort of willing to give access, willing to give interviews. They sort of were presenting themselves as this Taliban 2.0, you know, different from the previous Taliban, and within that package, willing to sort of do interviews. And that was the window that Ibrahim went in with. And keeping that access over 1 year was much harder than actually getting it in the first place. And even though getting it, we got it with the lower level Mukhtar, the second character, and sort of worked his way up to the big boss.
I noticed this sort of tendency throughout the film for these guys constantly to be looking over their shoulder, in the sense they were always fearful of being infiltrated. And no doubt this was something that they feared as well.
For sure. For sure. Especially, I think, the longer he stayed, because they just, you know, it's like they even explain in the film, they're like, well, what's he doing? He's making a documentary. It's like a movie, but with real people, you know? And I think that, but what's interesting about that is he had one person with him, his translator, Adel, who was really trusted, and he was like the only person that was with Ibrahim really this whole time. And the first time that there was this kind of threat voiced towards Ibrahim while he was filming, Adel translated it, and he said to Adel, don't ever translate that stuff to me again. And he didn't. He really listened to that. And when we got into the edit and we started translating all the material, Ibrahim himself was surprised in these moments. Like, he'd send me screenshots from the translation team, just like, oh my God, look at this. You know, and that was sort of when that whole side of it started to become more apparent.
And more real to him, no doubt. But keeping it for later, he was probably able to focus more. And keep going back, because he took breaks. He did. He would go for like a certain period, 6 to 8 weeks or something, until you could feel like they were just tired of him, you know? And then he would leave, and he would sort of wait until, you know, give them a moment, and then start approaching again, like, can I come back? I really need to film this, And he would go back again. And each time going back, I think he was just quite nervous about everything. Taking a bigger risk. So, to do what's been done in Hollywood Gate, to take those risks as a filmmaker, that's something that is difficult for other people to get their head around. Why in the world would you risk your life to go be with people that, as you say, the world has a very, very negative perception of? Why was this important? And frankly, does he fear for his life?
Well, I think Ibrahim, deep down inside, does have some kind of fear for the risk that he's taken and the position that it puts him in now, also being a spokesperson for this film. But he would never admit it, because he felt and feels so deeply for the pain that the Afghan people are going through.
And you see multiple times in the film where they're questioning why he's there. You know, there's one statement about if he doesn't do what he says he's going to do and keep his word in terms of representing us, we'll kill him.
Which actually he didn't know fully, because he told his translator, who was with him the whole time, after the first threat came through, he was like, don't translate that stuff for me. And Adele actually listened, and so those things were discovered in the edit later, and he'd be sending me screenshots saying, oh my God, look what they're saying, you know? So he wasn't fully aware, but he definitely felt it. He wasn't ignorant to it. And the last day, the parade that we shot, that was the last thing we shot, because it was very clear to him that that was dangerous. Yes, exactly. Because we had sort of been filming within one section of the leadership, but on that day, all the leadership was there, and Ibrahim was the only person on that stage with a camera.
Yeah.
And so other parts of the leadership, I think the head of security, etc., they noticed him, and they were like, wait, who are you, and what are you doing here?
Yes.
And you're coming with us. And he actually ran away from that after the parade, went straight to Kabul airport and caught the first plane out, and that was the last time that he was there.
Yeah.
And the burner phones that we had with the subjects, he deleted them and, you know, stopped those accounts after a few weeks of leaving.
The very idea of going in to a place like Afghanistan, where the U.S. has just, you know, made this disastrous withdrawal, putting your feet on the ground when you know that your life will be at risk in every moment, most people would say, he must be crazy.
I know.
Is Ibrahim crazy?
No, he's just a deeply empathetic person. He grew up in Egypt.
Yeah.
He grew up, you know, also observing. He also was a journalist before at Al Jazeera.
Yes.
And when he was a journalist, he worked in a TV show where they interviewed prominent leaders in the Middle East, etc. And he observed, you know, groups like the Taliban throughout his years growing up in journalism, and how people sort of revered them. And he always questioned this sort of praise of these kind of groups. And he knew that when they were coming back into power, that it meant devastation for the Afghan people. And I think he just felt deeply compelled to not allow that to be forgotten. And
to tell that story.
Yes, exactly, and tell that story. And he, honestly, he just, he really didn't think of the
danger.
The danger, and also the psychological toll that it takes on you, because we had to get him therapy, like in between.
Yes.
And this was really helpful because it's very difficult to sort of be within an ideology all day long that you don't agree with and not be able to say anything.
To lose your voice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he, early on, there's one story that he told recently that I only heard recently from him, that in the early days, there was one younger Talib who seemed really intelligent, you know, and he sort of had a dialogue with him, and he was like, you seem so intelligent, like why are you in this, why are you doing, like you could get a degree, you could be an engineer, you could go and like do something with your life. And that young Talib went to his commander and was like, you know what, I don't want to do this, I want to go and be an engineer, and I have other dreams maybe for myself. And the commander was like, where did you get these ideas?
Wow.
And he said, well, that cameraman. And he was called here, do you ever say something like that again, like you're dead, you know?
Wow.
And so that he then kept his mouth shut. He understood that saying anything to anyone was going to endanger him.
Yeah.
And he kept his mouth shut, and he kept his camera rolling. And he kept his camera rolling, you know, there's so much that we had to shoot to sort of just appease them.
No doubt.
You know? Like all their propaganda ideas, right? Because this film's very much about how they think they're going to use,
how they
learn
perceived.
from Hollywood, which is part of the title, even though it's on the gate, about propaganda. Oh, okay, now maybe we should start to create propaganda.
Yes.
And they're even learning that to use on their own people now, right? This narrative of, oh, the West is this, the infidels, the whatever, right? Propaganda is such a powerful tool in the mechanisms of creating war and control, right?
Yes.
Controlling society. And we had to shoot, so he was always watched and controlled what he would shoot, right? And the bits that we made the film with were like the bits in between when they forgot, because he spent so many hours there. And he would sit in rooms just holding the camera on them so they'd forget about the camera.
Yes.
And it wouldn't even be on because he knew he was shooting stuff that he's not going to use for hours and hours. And forget about the camera, they forget they're mic'd up, and then click, you know, start rolling.
That's the moment.
And and the film was built through those in-between moments.
Yeah, it's fascinating the idea of that bird's eye view in those very first days, because it was very clear that they, as the Taliban, you know, had stumbled into a victory that they never anticipated. Yeah. And you really see, I mean, as someone who covered the departure from Afghanistan, at least from a journalist's perspective, what it must have been really like for them walking into those buildings and seeing the mess that the coalition forces had left behind. And even they were surprised. How could they have left all of this here?
Yeah. Right?
Like total surprise.
No, and even a friend of mine who's incredibly intelligent, when she watched the film, she was like, honestly, I don't even look at it as like the Taliban and this and that. It's like one sort of foreign group, almost anthropological study of like what happens to a certain culture when they come in contact with another culture, right? Because they start to pick up these things and these objects, and they see all these objects, and you can see when they are walking out of the caves, they say, well, if we had had all this stuff, we would rule the world, right? So
Yes.
it's how these things start to infuse them also with ideas and change the way they think even, right?
Yeah.
And then they fix the weapons and what they, you know, how they end up with like calling the Tajikistan and threatening them.
I found it very interesting as well. I mean, walking into that hangar, the shots of the planes.
Right.
For me, this just sort of in every way symbolized, frankly, what America, sadly, has become in that part of the world.
Yeah.
And it was hearkening back to the days of Vietnam and the fall of Saigon. And we heard that analogy made time and time again. In your mind, what does this film mean in terms of a broader representation of what's happened over the last several years? Because if you look at the fall of Afghanistan, this disastrous departure, and then 4 years on, we have multiple wars, a deeply destabilized Middle East, even right now what's happening in Syria. And many would say that this is a direct result of the U.S. leaving Afghanistan, that this started a chain reaction. Putin would not have invaded Ukraine. Israel would not be doing what it's doing in Gaza, et cetera. And that may be a false assertion, but certainly to those who've watched the region as I have, and you have for decades, it feels as if that was the beginning.
Yeah. War begets war begets war.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Is it ever the solution? I mean, obviously we look at that and we question this war machine,
Yeah.
right? You have to question, is that the way to do it? Because no, we set these weird, unreachable goals, right? It started in Afghanistan as we're going after bin Laden, and then it became
Nation building,
freedom, democracy. Look at Iraq. Like, it's not working.
Yeah.
We have to obviously come up with a different way forward.
Yeah. When you think about sort of you picked Hollywood Gate, you also obviously did Navalny. What do these types of films mean to you?
The truth, you know? I think it's really important in film. What can you see through a film? 90 minutes with Alexei Navalny, I feel like, will give you so much more understanding of him as a human being than whatever you read in the news, you know, 2 minutes here, 2 minutes there. It's like you lived with him. You felt his sincerity, right?
Yes.
Watching what we left behind, Afghanistan now, just the destruction and the people that are suffering there. You know,
it's incredible.
It's like the Western media would love us to just forget and they don't focus on it anymore.
Exactly.
And that's what hopefully this film will get people to do, is just look at it. We don't just move on from Iraq. We don't just move on from Afghanistan. Afghanistan's still there. Iraq is still there. It has Syria.
Yeah.
You know?
These are the messes we've left behind.
Exactly.
I've challenged several world leaders, most recently the First Lady of Pakistan, about Afghans women and the situation in which they find themselves consistently rolling back every freedom. And the narrative that we see is that we gave them great promise for 20 years and then we utterly abandoned them.
I mean, it's horrific. Women right now, like, you know, the laws that were passed recently, they cannot speak outside of their own home. They can't go to a park with their child.
Yeah.
They can't go grocery shop. Like, they have to be, you know, supervised by a man. And still at the grocery store, I was speaking to an Afghan refugee recently whose wife is still in Kabul. I was like, so if she needs to go to the grocery store, how does that work? You know, he says, my brother or my uncle or someone comes over and takes her to the store. But still, even at the store, she can't speak. So she wants tomatoes. It's like, like trying to gesture. Can you imagine a woman, like even in a grocery store, which is, I mean.
They're erasing women.
It's completely, you can't sit like on the outside of your house and face the sun, right? You can't sing even inside your own house because your voice might
carry.
You can't read aloud inside your own house certain things. You can't have conversations with other women about certain topics. Like, those women are in prison.
One of the characters in the film, one of the people in the film, has basically said to his wife, you can't be a doctor anymore. You have to stay home. You have to follow Sharia. And this caused quite a bit of a conversation because the implementation of Taliban 2.0 was still in those early days up for debate.
Right. And can you imagine, had he let his wife be a doctor and maybe come to that base with him when they discover all those medicines that are left behind by our army, right? And what she would have maybe seen in those medicines and been able to implement it and at least get it into society before they all expired for the general population. Obviously, they don't care about the general population because those sat there expiring and his wife sat at home cooking.
When you think about your subjects, the way you choose to get involved in films, what is the one sort of similarity that they all have?
Fighting for the truth to be seen.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
It's something that just drives me. You know, it's like you're dealing with situations that are so sensitive, people that are holding a lot, politically sensitive, emotionally, you know. And when you are a documentarian, you have to sort of embed in those situations. You become very close to the subjects, right? I lived in the Black Forest with Alexei Navalny and Yulia, etc., for months, and was there the last day that we put him on the plane back to Russia, you know, and carrying Ibrahim through Hollywood Gate. It's you become very close, right? And yet you have to sort of make sure that you still keep a distance enough to make an objective film.
Yeah.
Which is challenging.
No doubt. I mean, you go into these situations perhaps with the preconceived notion of what it is you want to do or what you expect to see, and that, I assume, gets blown up pretty quickly.
I go into situations where we don't have an idea, and those are the situations that excite me, that just like, let's follow it. You know, like when we went in to meet Alexei Navalny, we didn't know they were going to make this phone call to Kudratsev. We didn't know he was going to go back. We just knew he'd been poisoned, and he was sitting, and he had just come out of a coma, and what was happening to this interesting figure, you know? So I feel like I'm sort of drawn to the person, because I know the person is going to walk an interesting path.
Yes.
And let's see where that path goes. So even the film I shot in Ukraine during the war, I was covering negotiations between Russia, Ukraine at first, but then those fell apart very quickly, and it became negotiations for weapons, negotiations with foreign nations, diplomacy. So I was very close to Kuleba while he was foreign minister. Rustem Umerov, who became the Minister of Defense. And I had no idea every day sort of where that story would go, you know?
Yeah. When you were shooting with Alexei Navalny, did you have a sense then that he was getting on a plane to his death?
No, absolutely not. And I don't know. He's such an optimistic person that he knew he was heading into potentially a grave challenge. But at the same time, I think 50% of him hoped that everything would be fine, you know? I think that he even hoped that upon immediate return, he would potentially not even go to prison, you know, because truth was on his side. And Navalny was someone that believed in the truth. And the trials that he was facing at that time were these sham trials. And then they sort of put him in prison for a small period of time. And then they started implementing all these new laws around extremism, around terrorism, right? They retroactively labeled his organization a terrorist organization and then tried him for that. That wasn't even existing when he was leaving. And the war hadn't started yet. So he sort of we didn't really fully know how far Putin was willing to go.
In hindsight, it's easier to say, oh, he was naive.
Right.
But you don't see it that way.
No. I think that when you are someone like Navalny who, you know, commits to fighting for that kind of path, for the future of the country that the dream that you hold for that country.
Yeah.
You have to be an optimistic person.
Yeah.
You know?
Obviously in Hollywood Gate, there were opportunities to frankly break news, as we would say. And I'm talking about, you know, the Russians and what they were attempting to do in Afghanistan, fighting a covert war, essentially.
Well, you know, Christo Grozev, who I worked with so closely on Navalny, he is just the most genius investigator. And for the last 4 years, he's been on and off working on an investigation about Russia's involvement with the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And then he saw the full... I sent him early footage when I started working on it, because I was like, look, this is really interesting. But at that point, we hadn't shot these shots at the end with Arkhipov and the Russians, Iranians, etc., that you see on the stage at the end of the film. And when he saw the full film, I think it was in June here in London, he immediately, in his sort of Christo style, did like the reverse face search and started figuring out who's this Russian guy on the stage. And it was the missing link to this huge investigation around a Russian bounty program where they were basically paying the Taliban per head of U.S. soldier that they were able to kill, which led to many suicide bombings and
some of the biggest attacks.
Right, attacks on U.S. convoys, U.S. bases. And this was, at the time, covered up because the negotiations with the White House, with the Taliban were going on. And then even when Biden came to power, it was continued. They continued to sort of not look at that situation, and so
as if not to muddy the waters.
Right, and this whole investigation is now out, as you see in
the New York Times. Yeah, it's, to a journalist, it looks as if, you know, just the great game is alive and well when you're talking about so many different powers. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, when you see reports of Russian interference, whether it be in Afghanistan or elsewhere, elections, for example, in the United States, you don't find any of this surprising.
No, and I think that is the genius of this kind of filmmaking and documentary filmmaking, where you just capture and you're there and you capture. Like at the time, we didn't know that we were capturing these individuals, right?
Yeah.
And you just make the film, and these kind of films are so hard to make and so hard to distribute these days. Mm-hmm. And I hope that this huge investigation shows the value of this kind of filmmaking, that it helps us sort of. You know, it's a deeper look and a deeper investigation, and helps us to understand the world we're living in better.
I imagine that sort of ability to go, to spend the time, to engage with the people at this kind of level over days, over months, over years. Mm-hmm. Very different from what the mainstream media is able to accomplish simply because of budget. What is the toughest thing in that sense for documentary filmmakers? Is it the budgeting? Is it the time constraints? I mean, where's the sort of challenge there?
It's the life.
Because you are giving up your
limitation,
life.
Right.
Yeah.
Like in Ukraine, I think I'd lived there for 6, 7, 8 months, sort of back and forth on those overnight trains, you know. Living
it's literal immersion.
It really is. And you just, like, as far as another life, like, I don't have a family, I don't have kids, you know, it is... It takes...
That's what it requires.
It does. It requires a lot from you.
Yeah. Do you think that the value there, obviously, is that you do get that firsthand knowledge?
Yes, and like for me, I just love it. You know, I love my work. I love understanding the truth, like being able to be with Kuleba and Rustem, etc., during like these critical points, and just watching the day-to-day unfold. You have an understanding of this war, of this conflict, of the multiple sides to it, and nothing is black and white. Yeah. You know, and I have, even with the Alexei, with Navalny, sitting there in the Black Forest for those days and knowing them so well, you just understand things in a different way, in a deeper way than, I don't know. And that, for me, is super fulfilling.
No doubt, no doubt.
I mean, I'm sure that's what drives you as a journalist as well. It's just like having these conversations, having these intimate understanding of different perspectives, you know. And I've always been someone who loves different perspectives, because I grew up that way. Like I lived in Asia, I lived in Canada, Japan, all these cultures that you had to sort of assimilate into. And that for me is life, really. Like when I can, it doesn't necessarily mean I agree with all the perspectives, but just being able to see different perspectives is super fulfilling.
What was most surprising to you in making Hollywoodgate? Well, the scenes where they are in the gym.
I would say, the gym, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But
high on the unintentional comedy scale.
Yeah, exactly, unintentional comedy scale. But I think just how deep the ignorance is, also.
Yes.
You know, around their vision, their definition of women and women's society around women, and just their narrative around the world, even. Like, it's just, you know, they have had zero exposure to, like, you know, what's happening outside that little bubble.
For filmmakers, you're there for a long time. Mm-hmm. How does timing work?
Yeah, and then, you know, it's so key. Like, for example, we had to put out Hollywoodgate in an election year.
Yeah.
Which was difficult because it sort of shows a critical look at what happened around the pullout, which then everyone ends up blaming Biden for. So then people are afraid to...
The politicizing of the film.
The politicizing of the film, but it has nothing to do with Biden. This is a problem that was created over 20 years with
multiple administrations.
Two Democratic, two Republican.
Yes.
And it's like, we just need to look at this as a whole. And as a country, as an American citizen, it's my responsibility to question our foreign policy.
Yeah.
And yet, like, you know, people are so afraid that it would be, you know, looked at as troublesome for Biden, and that's just the wrong lens to look at it through.
Do you think that
it was very difficult? No, I think it is. It really is. That problem was created by 4 different administrations.
Yeah.
They all equally hold the burden, and they, you know, should have communicated and come together to create a different solution there. Not each new administration coming in and creating their own goals, right?
Yeah. What do you want audiences to walk away with from Hollywoodgate?
Well, I think Hollywoodgate walks this fine line of, you see the Taliban. They are, you know, in the Western media, we've spent 20 years pushing one narrative of them, which is just problematic, and these killers that are just living in caves and they're just killing and killing, killing. And then you see in the Taliban in Hollywoodgate that they also eat, they also sleep, they also are funny. They're
human.
Kind of weird. They're human, right?
Yeah.
And so at the same time, not apologizing for them, not saying like, okay, wait, just not trying to humanize, but at the same time seeing that they are humans, looking at this and going, okay, hold on a second. Maybe we should try a different approach, right? Because they're obviously just deeply uneducated, are a product of 40 years of war, that have only lived in caves and been taught war and grown up with war, fed war.
Yes.
Right? And is there something else that we can do? Is there some other approach that we can take?
Yeah. Desiree, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Guatemala. Adventure awaits at Guatemala. You can dare to explore the jungles or go on a canopy tour. The rainforests at Guatemala are perfect for thrill seekers to engage in many action-packed adventures. Guatemala is in fact known for its great outdoors. Its subtropical rainforests are protected, so people can enjoy nature-friendly activities such as hiking, biking, and horse riding. You can also hike up the Mayan pyramids. Tikal is a famous archaeological site hidden deep within the rainforest, where 70-meter or 230 feet high pyramids are seen through the canopies. It is a known UNESCO World Heritage Site that has more than 3,000 structures. And if a pyramid isn't enough for you, then you can also try hiking up an active volcano. Guatemala's Volcan Pacaya remains one of the most hiked volcanoes in the country. Molten lava slowly pours through its summit, creating huge dust and lava fields that admittedly create an impressive landscape. Also popular in Guatemala is the breathtaking Caribbean coast. You can reach it by boating along the Rio Dulce. It is a highly recommended trip as you'll get to experience a unique, isolated island feel. There, you'll arrive to hammocks and a rustic-themed beachside. Of course, you should go meet the locals. Explore the unique highlands region of western Guatemala, which is also known in Spanish as El Altiplano. Many of the modern-day indigenous Mayan groups reside there, and it's fantastic to listen to them speak in their native tongue. The locals retain the sacred rituals of their ancestors too, and you'll definitely enjoy the view of the great mountains and untouched beauty of the region's surroundings. Take a trip to the city proper. Although most tourists would rather skip the traffic-induced capital, you should still pay a visit. The place still has enticing gems yet to be discovered.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Sean, thank you so much for joining Al Arabiya. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
So 1,000 days into this conflict and the war in Ukraine has not been won. In your mind, what are the next steps?
Well, I think you almost have to step back a little bit from that and go, what is achievable now? For the last 2.5 years of the conflict, there's been a view, certainly from the Ukrainian view, we will get rid of Russia. We've been fighting them for 300 years. They've constantly been trying to destroy our language, our communities, our culture, our families. We will prevail, as we always do. But actually, on a visit back there 3 or 4 weeks back, there was much more of a sense of awareness. And that prospect of victory, if that is clearing out Russians from every corner of Ukraine, that seems to be fading fast. And actually, there does feel a much more of a palpable sense of how do we emerge from this with a positive story, positive narrative? How do we emerge from this with our security and our borders secure of what remains? How do we rebuild our country? And how do we live, grow and live our life beyond this? Because it's a terrible price that's being paid at the moment. And it's very difficult to see how Ukraine can win in the conventional sense. It's also very difficult to see how Russia can win. And therefore, how do you bring this awful situation to an end? And that involves compromises which are uncomfortable to talk about because all of them have horrible implications. But the bloodshed is just devastating and on both sides. And that somehow is not sustainable.
How closely tied in your mind is this fatigue that you saw on the ground in Kyiv, for example, in Ukraine more broadly, to the election of Donald Trump in the United States?
One of the questions I asked when I was out there, I had a whole load of questions to ask people. I said, what do you feel about Donald Trump? And they were, of course, all awfully very polite because they know how heavily dependent they are on American aid, particularly. But when you push them a bit, perhaps over a beer, one of the things they said, you do realise we've been fighting Russia for 300 years. Do you really think that one Western politician in 24 hours is going to solve this? And it was a really poignant moment. It felt like, as a Westerner, I was almost trying to impose my will on them, as it were. And it's plain that that's not going to be the answer. I think the trouble is there's lots of implications here. The Trump effect, as a bit of a student of history, if you look back when he came in on the first term, I'm going to build a continuous war with Mexico. Didn't quite manage that. I'm going to bring peace to the Middle East. Didn't quite do that. And I'm going to sort out that horrible little man from North Korea. Didn't do that either. But what it did do is a clear intent of where his focus was going to be. And therefore, it's pretty clear, although solving the war in 24 hours is clearly not possible, it's pretty clear where his intent is. Is it to continue supporting Ukraine until the end, or is it about trying to draw the war to an end in some way? What that looks like, probably only President Trump-elect actually knows what that looks like.
Less than 2 weeks from that historic election in the United States, and you have the G20 now reflecting in their statement less of a we must win, continuous and unfiltered or unadulterated support for Ukraine, and also, of course, a realization on the part of European governments that if they're going to do this, they're going to have to go it alone. And when they look at their budgets and their balance sheets, it's just not going to be possible.
No, and if you look at it from literally big picture stuff, the Europeans and the Americans are given about the same amount of money. But if you look at about military aid, the US provides far more because it's got far deeper pockets, it's got far bigger inventories, far bigger war stocks. And therefore, it would be almost impossible for Europe to match. They could potentially dig deeper into their pockets. But it isn't the money that's required. It's manpower and weapons. And those weapons, you can't nip down to the local supermarket and buy them. They take ages to be built, and we've emptied our war stock of those weapons. I think what's interesting from geopolitical, though, again, people are very scared about the Trump effect. They've talked about him walking away from NATO, talked about... I think actually there are some things which I think we've just, although at times the message...
Wasn't he the greatest thing to happen to NATO, though?
Well, in a way, that is my view, that, we had only a third of NATO members were paying their way. And that's not right. As a nation who also pays their way, we don't pay as much as America do, but, America spends double the amount proportionally on defence and far more actually in purely quantums. But 2/3 of NATO weren't actually paying their way. Well, why should they enjoy the benefit of security? Since those Trump days, we've now got over 2/3 of NATO paying their way. Is that enough? No. But I do think so. Some of the Trump rhetoric is designed, I think, to say, look, America will look after China. Russia's right on your doorstep. You're feeling the heat there. Europe, step up and sort it out.
Yeah.
And in a way, we're seeing that with Poland, who've doubled their defence budgets. Most of Europe's sweating a little bit, going, if America's not going to sort this out, we need to. What does that look like? And I think that's created a really interesting dynamic in NATO. And it's a harsh reminder that 3 decades of sort of post-Cold War peace dividend are well and truly over.
We have a new Secretary General. He's coming from the Netherlands, Mark Rutte. It's a gentleman I've interviewed on a number of occasions. That's a country that hasn't been paying their 2%. There are questions, of course, about what kind of leadership he's going to bring to the organization. In your mind, does this leave, with the election of Donald Trump, perhaps a window for NATO to become even more cohesive?
I think it'll be a defining moment for NATO. I have to say, part of my scepticism is that if you measure military capability by mass, NATO is a resounding success. You add up all the tanks, add up all the aircraft, it's fantastic. The problem with a committee is that you can only move at the pace of the slowest. And I think we've already found with Ukraine, providing weapons for Ukraine has not been something that all nations agree with. The UK was the first to offer tanks. There was lots of reluctance to offer tanks. And the danger is that NATO, actually, when the UK was providing Storm Shadow, for example, long-range missiles, and America turned around and went, I think you probably don't want to do that until we've all agreed it. And as a result, Putin sat there watching, laughing. He lives in an autocracy where he makes a decision, it happens. Yeah. NATO has some huge benefits, but it's also demonstrating some significant challenges. And there is a view that what do we do if President Putin decides to have a go at Lithuania or Latvia? NATO members, but would NATO roundly sign up for a nuclear war based on going into those countries? Now, the obvious political answer is, of course they would. But I think Putin's already seeing, with his sabre rattling, which he's doing regularly, just how nervous the West is, just how nervous. And by forming an alternative to NATO, that sort of axis of evil, potentially North Korea, Iran, China, he's already starting to form an axis of body that's saying we can challenge the West, because they might look big and strong, but actually the glue that ties them together isn't that strong at all.
When you think about how this is all going to look 20 years from now, in your mind, did the West sell Ukraine a raw bill of goods in terms of what they were going to do, what they would be willing to do, and what they could afford to do in support of Ukraine?
So one of the questions I asked when I was out in Ukraine was about the West's support. And what was fascinating, again, they were very polite initially, but their memory of the fall of the Soviet Union, their memory, I mean, if you remember, for the viewers particularly, Ukraine became the third largest nuclear power in the world because the former Soviet Union had forward deployed its weapons into Ukrainian soil. So when the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had all these nuclear weapons. They didn't have the launch codes, but they had the weapons. And as a result, America, the UK, Russia sat down with Ukraine and said, look, it's not healthy for you to have those weapons. We'll guarantee your sovereignty, all of us, if you give up those nuclear weapons. So the Budapest Memo of 1994 was signed. And 20 years later, Putin rips it up and goes into Crimea. Now, where the Ukrainians remember that period is they were coerced. They were forced into signing that. And the only reason they agreed to sign it was because you, the West, guaranteed our security. When we called on that insurance policy, nobody was there.
We've shown them what that's worth.
And I think it's very easy, yes, to criticise Putin for what he did, but he went into Crimea, saw that the West didn't actually do anything, wrote a couple of stiff letters. Really? Is that really what the security guarantees of the Budapest Memo 94 were about? Now, I wasn't there, you weren't there, you know, but I do understand that it's one thing writing something, it's quite another actually doing something.
And that is part of the problem, isn't it? I mean, we've had technically 20 years to understand Vladimir Putin, to understand his red lines, how far he's willing to go. Most people called it wrong when, you know, the invasion happened. Nobody really thought that he would make that move because economically it didn't make sense. Why would you jeopardize your place in the world order? But he did it, and he did it anyway. And it looks as if now, in a sense, he's going to be able to walk away from this quite successfully, because the conversation now seems to be surrounding how do we end this and allow Russia to save face.
Yeah, that sticks in the throat a bit, doesn't it, about saving face. I think if you would be an idealist, and you know, when I was younger I was an idealist, now I'm much more of a pragmatist.
Now you're a grown-up.
You know, the idealist would say, no, you can't hand Russia a victory, because what will that mean? The flip side of that is that there is a view at the moment that Ukraine is locked into an attritional battle. It is the smaller party. An attritional battle traditionally the smaller party loses. It's a bit like medieval times. We'll meet on the battlefield, have a cup of tea, and then have a go at each other. The strongest and most numerous tend to win. Well, this attritional battle, unfortunately, is favouring Russia. They're on the front foot in the Donbass. They're on the front foot in the Kursk region. And therefore, if you continue fighting, one of the risks is that Russia actually makes a breakthrough, and all of a sudden it could be a lot more territory. It potentially could be an endgame for Ukraine completely. And therefore, rather than be an idealist and say, look, we're never going to stop until we win or we lose, is there some other very unpalatable but some other solution? And I sensed from my visit, I sensed from a lot of the conversations I have, and I'm still connected to a lot of very well-informed parts of this landscape, and that sense of what does victory look like, they're fading in its hope rather than expectation. Whereas the expectation of we're running out of people, running out of ideas, and Trump's rhetoric may well just be the final nail in we've got to find an alternative way to draw this to a close. The question then is, how does that appease President Zelensky? Part of it is you've got to rebuild your country. Part of it is we're going to need some security guarantees, and I'm not going to accept a signature on a bit of paper. But also for Putin, how do you actually coerce Putin into signing something or agreeing something? You've got to have a sweetener. He's got all the aces at the moment. If you're going to stop, why stop? So, in a way, I wouldn't be at all surprised if one of the things that will be discussed behind closed doors is stopping some of the sanctions, returning his place. And that's distasteful, but if that is the price of bringing this conflict to an end, is that a price worth paying? And what are the implications of that for Xi Jinping looking at Taiwan?
Well, it's probably an unavoidable price, considering the fact that, we're talking about budgets, we're talking about economies, we're talking about the U.S. government, who, under Donald Trump, will presumably not be willing to spend as much as they have spent. But interestingly enough, we've seen, obviously, the Biden administration making some last-minute pushes, last-ditch efforts, if you will, to continue their policies towards Ukraine. They've got a couple of months left, and even though he is a lame duck, technically, it doesn't seem as if that's keeping them from continuing to push their agenda. Does that leave perhaps some possibilities for Zelensky?
No. The last 48 hours has been fascinating, as we've talked about. Let's be specific. ATACMS, these army tactical missile systems, which are vaunted as the answer to the Maiden's Prayer. They're a supersonic missile. They go ballistic. They go 200 miles. The downside is they've only got a £500 charge in the middle of them. They cost well over $1 million each, and there's not many of them around. So they're very effective at surgical strike, but Russia's already moving its fighter jets out of range of those, so they can't be used.
And this has devolved into a drone war as is.
Well, it's also, I think, the short. We tend to talk about drones as being short range. The debate about long-range weapons, that can the West give them, we're running out of them, can we allow them to use them into Russia? It's become a really convoluted conversation about something which, frankly, is not going to change the course of the war. What has been happening behind the scenes is that Ukraine has been saying, OK, we may not be able to give you these long-range weapons, but if we could give you all of the parts, sensors, rocket packs, explosives, and you assemble them, you can assemble something that's much more modern than we could give you. To the West to develop it would mean we'd have to do safety cases, we'd do lots of safety. You don't have to do any of that. And we've actually seen over the last couple of months Ukraine be a lot more effective at doing deep strikes into Russia.
Yes.
And so the danger is we get this argument seduced about, will the West provide? Actually, this is about, can Ukraine strike deep into Russia? And it is able to do that now. I think the very different question is that these ATACMS, I think, in a way, people say, is this Biden's last? No, it's a really modest step. I think the reason he's done it now, bluntly, is that in the Kursk region, Ukraine has a small enclave. When it went in there in August, it's been pushed out of a third of that enclave. Putin will not want to negotiate whilst there's a Ukraine presence on Russian territory. He's going to do everything possible to get that cleared. He's got 50,000 troops up there, apparently 12,000 North Korean troops as well. He is going to be doing everything. Just imagine the instructions he's giving to his commanders. Don't come back until you've cleared that area.
Yes.
Massive casualties, and therefore what it appears that Biden's going is, we need to help you with that enclave. We're not giving you weapons that you can strike deep within Russia. We're giving you weapons that you can strike in Russia as part of protecting that enclave and supporting, holding out for as long as you can. I think that's far more logical than some knee-jerk against Trump, because frankly, the day Trump comes in, he could sign an order saying, no, you can't use them anymore.
Yeah.
Simple.
And did President Biden undercut Europe?
By doing the by putting the weapons in early. I don't buy that. No, the trouble is, this whole weapons thing, I think, is a bit of a non-story. If you need help, I give you weapons. As long as you use them within the law of armed conflict, I shouldn't actually say, we can't do that with them, but you can do that with them.
But that's been the story of this entire conflict.
I know, but because that's been the story of the conflict, when you then take those restrictions away, you provide Putin with the opportunity to wail and shake the nuclear sabre. I mean, that's the irony of this whole thing, that ultimately there shouldn't have been a story about this. It should have been, here's the weapons, use them as you see fit. And the problem by having now is that if Keir Starmer now makes a thing with the media about suddenly, green light on, I think it'll just happen under the radar. I think he'll just say, President Zelensky, you've got the weapons. Nobody's marking your homework and seeing what's happening. We're not going to make an announcement and play to Putin's game. We've always said you can use the weapons. Let's face it, Lord Cameron had originally said you can use those weapons as you see fit. They were reined in because of the US angle. So I don't think that by playing all this out in public, it doesn't help. And I suspect Keir Starmer, rather than going, yes, we're going to confront Putin, is just quietly going to Zelensky, carry on, use the weapons, don't break the law of armed conflict, and we'll continue to support you as best we can.
And so the market chatter that we've heard over the last 24 hours suggesting that this could push President Putin to use nuclear weapons, in your mind, if he was going to do that, he would have already done it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a regular talking about this stuff. I'm grey-haired. I served in the military when we were in the middle of a Cold War. We talked about nuclear weapons. We did nuclear fallout drills on our missions. We were planning one-way missions, never expecting to come back. You know, and then all of a sudden the peace dividend happened. Nobody talked. There's nobody around these days that has lived through that time. And the danger is, therefore, Putin knows it's a really effective, saber to rattle that scares everybody. And it's worked. He keeps saying it, and we step back from the brink. Let's be absolutely clear. If we wanted to stop Russia from invading Ukraine, if we put a no-fly zone in there tomorrow, my colleagues in the air forces would love to have a go at that. Putin struggled against a really old, decrepit air force. Imagine if a 21st century air force to sweep in. He'd be stopped in a heartbeat. We don't want to do that. That's a choice we're making. So we could do it. We've just chosen not to.
Yeah, consistently. In your mind, post-war environment, when we talk about investment in Ukraine, there are investment vehicles at the ready. BlackRock and JP Morgan have one. The idea being, of course, that between the United States and the European Investment Bank, there's going to be billions of dollars worth of investment going into Ukraine. But, of course, that does have implications for insurance, for example, markets, and whether or not, this war is really coming to a close. Security guarantees. Given the lackadaisical way in which we have behaved towards the Ukrainians so far, what kind of security guarantees can they reasonably expect?
It's a great question. I think part of it is there's been a lot of talk about NATO providing it. I have to say it's quite difficult to see how NATO will be the answer. First of all, NATO isn't a club you just come and join. There's all sorts of things. It's a collective. You will have to contribute towards it in some way, militarily, financially, etc. And there's certain standards that I don't think Ukraine will meet for quite some time to come. Quite apart from the fact, you're now Putin, I'm now Zelensky, and we're negotiating an end. If I tell you I'm going to be part of NATO, Putin's going to go, unless that's off the table,
there's no conversation.
There's no conversation. So it's quite difficult to see how NATO is the answer. But that doesn't mean there isn't an answer. There are bilateral, trilateral arrangements that can be made, military bases that are now forward deployed onto Ukrainian soil. There's lots of ways that could make it a lot more difficult for Putin to take a breather for a few years and then start again. Because if he had an American base, a French base, a UK base near the front line of the new border, in whatever that was, that would put a very different dynamic in to the Putin's mind if he thought he was going to take another chunk out of Ukraine anytime soon. So I think there are other ways of providing that security guarantee. I think the financial one is really interesting because the end of the Second World War, obviously Germany was devastated. That became the powerhouse of Europe.
Yes.
So there is the potential.
Until now.
But there is the potential for Ukraine to be rebuilt and modernised, and this could be the foundations of a brave new future for Ukraine that has had a very difficult 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. A land of opportunity, maybe.
What is your assessment of the sort of European response post-election in the United States? And I'm speaking specifically about the call between Olaf Scholz and Vladimir Putin, and the reaction from other European leaders, outrage from Zelensky, but outrage from Emmanuel Macron as well.
Europe's in a slightly difficult position, isn't it? I think.
Well, it's a tough one when the French are the ones that are pushing back the most, right? And being less willing to negotiate.
The trouble is, I mean, at its heart, President Trump says it's America first. Actually, that sounds very provocative, but the reality is every country operates with its own national interest at first. Every country.
Yes.
And so not every country will feel the same heat from Russia. There is a view, I mean, let's face it, most of our countries are suffering a bit of a COVID hangover financially at the moment. Therefore, there's a lot of demand for money internally as well as externally. Now, one argument you could say, Russia's a threat, we have to ramp up our defence spending. When I was in the Ministry of Defence, the two driving threats that drove how much money we spent were Russia and China. Russia has now spent itself. It's lost most of its main battle tanks. It is no longer the threat from an equipment perspective that it was before. Worse than that, we were a little bit scared of it. Now we've seen how inept it is and how poor both the equipment is and also how it operates.
But they are rebuilding and reindustrializing
how long
around
will it take
the military
to make that
economy.
Happen, though?
Even if it's years. Even if it's years, they're up against what we now see is a Europe that is significantly degraded in terms of its economic power.
Yes, but I think if you do the harsh metrics, the West, even without America, is still far overmatches what Russia has. And it's not just in quantity, it's also in quality. Now, does that mean, would we want to take on Russia because of the nuclear threat? Absolutely not. But it does mean that Russia would have to think twice. It was expecting to walk into Ukraine and over a matter of days take Ukraine. 1,000 days later, it is still suffering huge casualties, lost so much equipment. It is not a very potent military machine. And if President Putin had his time again, I wonder whether he'd play his cards quite the same. We were talking earlier that one of the challenges is it's very difficult to know what his motivation is here. Is it because he wants a big stone statue of himself in the Great Hall, like Peter the Great, that he's been part of rebuilding the Russian Empire? He said he wanted to make Russia great again. It's been a bit of a pariah on the world stage. He said he wanted to stop the expansion of NATO. NATO's expanded as a result of it, and Putin himself found himself indicted by the International Criminal Court. It doesn't feel like a very positive outcome, but if he secures that land bridge, the Donbass and Crimea, despite the casualties, he may gloss over that and declare victory. But I think the oligarchs and everybody who actually provides the power base will be going, you paid a massive price for that. We don't want to do that again, do we?
In your mind, what is the best way to position President Zelensky going into these negotiations?
Well, incredibly difficult, because it doesn't matter how you spin it. Ukraine is on the back foot. They are struggling. They've been heavily reliant on international support. That international support is waning. It's not waxing at the moment. The coffers are basically bare, and the defence industrial base of Russia is still ramping up tremendously. They've got oil revenues paying for it all. So it doesn't look like a winning hand. Therefore, how do you create the circumstances where you end up with some form of peace? Now, I'm not entirely convinced that Putin will want to have that conversation. He certainly won't want to be bullied into it, and unless he feels he's won. So I think the answer is less about what Zelensky can stomach. It's more about what will need to be on the table for Putin to consider that actually it's worth his while stopping.
As this war winds down, in your mind, does this help or hurt President Zelensky at home? Are we going to have a Churchill effect post-1945?
I think it's very likely. And I was quite... So one of the questions I was asking when I was out in Ukraine, and it's not a big... I can't speak for the whole of Ukraine, But I thought I would go out and ask, what do they think of President Zelensky? And I was asking loads of people, barmen, all sorts. And I thought they'd all be resoundingly for him. And they looked at me quizzically. And I said, well, from outside, I know nothing about the politics, but this man has cometh the hour, cometh the man. He has stepped up. He's galvanised support internationally. And all of them just went, yeah, he's done that, but he doesn't get my vote.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't be drawn on it. And so it is only a tiny dip test, but most wartime leaders struggle over time. That if he's a signal of the resilience of Ukraine, that's great.
Yes.
If he translates to being stubborn, when actually the mood of the country is, I've had enough. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying it's a really difficult time. And it may be I just spoke to the wrong people in Kyiv, but I very much sense he has done a fantastic job in very difficult circumstances. Whether he endures beyond this is a very different question.
Yeah. John, it's great to have you on Al Arabiya. Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken pays a visit to Syria's neighbours to seek their support for a diplomatic push to establish an inclusive, non-sectarian government following on from the fall of Bashar Al-Assad. Blinken's tour is mostly focused on Syria, but he's also discussing the situation in Gaza. Meanwhile, the UN General Assembly has voted to demand an immediate ceasefire there, as well as the release of all hostages. The FBI Director Chris Wray announces he's stepping aside before his 10-year term ends. President-elect Donald Trump had said he was planning to fire him. We ask why. And last week's killing of the United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson raises serious questions about the US healthcare system and serious concerns about the safety of US executives. Hello and welcome to the programme. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is on what's been described as a crisis tour of the Middle East. Well, his first stop is Jordan, where he arrived earlier on today, and his visit comes 5 days after the overthrow of the former Syrian president, Bashar Al-Assad. So what is Blinken trying to achieve here? Well, Washington's top diplomat is pressing for a Syrian-led transition in Damascus, aiming to pave the way for a new inclusive government and open channels for humanitarian aid. Well, Blinken also says that the US government will fully support the new government in Damascus, and he wants to get neighbouring countries on board as well. Well, tomorrow, Blinken will fly to Turkey. Well, in recent days, neighbouring Israel has been carrying out large-scale strikes on Syria, which Israel says are intended to destroy strategic weapons in the country. Well, shortly after Assad fled Syria, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced that he'd ordered his army to seize the demilitarized zone in the Syrian-controlled part of the Golan Heights, a move viewed by some countries as a violation of a 1974 agreement which established the UN patrolled buffer zone. Well, to tell us more, we can speak now to Dan Meridor, who is the former Israeli Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Intelligence, who joins us from Jerusalem. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, sir. Did you see...
Thank you. Good to be here with you.
Thank you. Did you see the fall of Bashar al-Assad coming?
No, I did not. As many things in recent years or in my life experience, we are sure that we know enough. Good intelligence, good assessment, and we make mistakes. One was at the 1973 war. The other was on October 7th, 2023, last year, with the attack of the barbaric Hamas group and then the attack of Hezbollah on us. And yes, we did not see the fall. I did not see the fall of the Assad regime, I have to say. Let me just make clear, I'm not the government now. I'm not in the government. I speak for myself. And maybe other people knew. I don't think so. Things sometimes happen that we don't expect. And it's after over 50 years of the Assad family rule over Syria, not a very democratic rule, I have to say. But the collapse of this regime is creating an opportunity for a new era for Syria and for all of us.
Yes, indeed, and I appreciate you pointing out that you're a former minister and a former deputy prime minister. You do not represent the government of Israel. But tell me this, do you think people in Israel feel safer without Bashar al-Assad in power in Damascus?
Well, I would say this, we don't know what comes next, and it's in the making now. Maybe Secretary Blinken's visit has to do with that, and the talk with Turkey, which might have had something to do with what happened in Syria, has to do with that. If in the end of this transition, we have a stable and prosperous and peaceful Syria, this will be good for all of us. It is outside this axis of Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, that really was hit quite badly because of their stupid attack on us. And if what we see is a good neighbor, good for them, first of all, and not a dictatorship, not a regime like the Assad family had there, but a more stable and prosperous regime, it's going to be good, first of all, for the Syrians, and then for the neighbors, including us.
We've heard numerous reports of Israeli strikes across Syrian territory during the last few days. The latest strikes reportedly close to Damascus. What's your understanding of what Israel is trying to achieve here?
Well, here I have to repeat, I'm not speaking for the government. I don't have in my possession the calculation. People say in the press that they wanted to make sure that those who come in will not be the Al-Qaeda sort of people who will be a big problem for all of us, but I can't tell you. Assad had, I suppose, have been piling up capability of chemical weapons, maybe chemical weapons. This might have been the target. I'm not a good source for this question. I don't know the answer. In the end, this is not the solution. The solution needs to be a stable Syrian regime, hopefully for them inclusive with all the sects, whether it's Alawites or Shiites or Sunni or Druze, Christians, whoever there is. And maybe Syria will try to catch its place in a more normal atmosphere than in the past. What happens now is people try to make sure that their interests are guarded, but in the end, it's the Syrian interest that should be taken into account, hopefully by a stable and peaceful regime.
Indeed, but when we look at these 500-plus Israeli strikes that have been carried out across Syria during the last few days, I mean, I know you can only speculate, but there are a lot of people speculating as well on Israel's behalf that this is all part of some sort of territorial expansion plan. What do you say to that?
As I said, I don't speak for the government, and to tell you secretly, nobody here is I'm in opposition to the government, so I'm not the guy to ask. But I don't think it's an expansion plan. This seems crazy. I don't think so. What we need is a stable and peaceful neighbor, not expansion. What is expansion for? I don't think that's the goal. But again, you need to find somebody from the government, and they will answer you more authoritatively than I can do.
Are you encouraged by the messages we've heard coming out of the new leadership in Damascus?
Well, I see television. I hear the press. I don't know who speaks for what. Whether Mr. al-Julani is seeking peace and stability and good neighborly relationship, then it's great. If it's not there, and if he does not consolidate the power, I don't know who comes next. It's a big question mark. No doubt the Assad regime was not one of the good guys, first of all, for Syria. They massacred hundreds of thousands of Syrians in what they called mistakenly the Arab Spring. It was a very heavy spring then. So it was not a good regime for the Syrians, first of all. Now they fled, they're out. Will there be a better regime? No, they can take the the option or the example of Egypt, who had peace with us, and I think is gaining from it. No Israeli or Egyptian was killed or wounded in over almost 50 years now. Jordan and Israel have a peace treaty, another peace treaty that works well for both sides. It's not that all problems are over. We have the Palestinian question that is not yet resolved and needs to be resolved. But there was the Iranian Axis threat that was threatening not merely us, but what they call the moderate Sunni countries, both the nuclear ambitions and the subversive activities all over the place with the proxies. And if the Sixes has been dealt a blow, I don't think people should be sorry for that. Will there be a stability? I hope there is, and I hope we can contribute to that.
As we said in the introduction, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Jordan on this so-called crisis tour. I believe it's his 12th visit to the region since the 7th of October attacks of last year. What do you think he can achieve during this regional visit?
Well, I have no clue as to what he is about. I think that, first of all, Jordan might have been on the target list of the Iranian Axis, and they might have been trying to destabilize it. I hope this is somewhat, if not over, at least much weaker challenge now. Jordan is a neighbor of Syria. And in the past, Syria attacked Jordan in 1970, trying to topple down the regime. And we have helped King Hussein to survive, if you remember that. I think that Jordan has an interest. They have, I think, many Syrian refugees in Jordan. So I think the feeling that America is in good context, an ally, if you like, with Jordan is important for Jordan. There is a vacuum here if really what we see is a weakening of the Iranian influence here. Who fills in this vacuum? I think if America steps in, it's good for everybody. If others will step in, I don't know what the result will be.
One of the dilemmas for the United States and for lots of other countries as well is looking at the new leaders in Damascus and asking whether the group in charge, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, should be taken off a terrorism designation list. Knowing what you know of them, and I know you're not party to sort of internal government documents, but what's your thinking? Should they go off that list?
I don't know enough. I know things about their past. Everybody knows that. They were not the good guys. They were part of terror groups. Have they changed? Do they really mean to rule Syria peacefully? It was quite encouraging to understand that there was an instruction not to go for vengeance and not to destroy everything around you. We'll see how it develops. If they want to be inclusive and find a way to resuscitate Syria from the awful results of the Assad regime and the massacres, then it's good. I can't tell you. I don't know enough. I believe the American intelligence and maybe ours and others will try to find out as much as they can. And I think people will be judged by their actions, and the people will see what they do. The tones that came out of Damascus were a little more encouraging than what one might have expected. But is it just music? Is the lyrics different lyrics? We'll hear.
One of the things we heard from King Abdullah in Jordan there in those talks with Antony Blinken was that the first step towards reaching comprehensive regional calm is to end the Israeli war in Gaza, he said. Why do you think there's been so little progress when it comes to the diplomacy? And as we've been saying, 12 visits to the region by Antony Blinken, still no ceasefire. Why not?
Well, I hear what the Americans said. They said Hamas is to take the blame. They don't want to come in, so I can't speak for them. Hamas has been hit very badly, but still they hold 100 hostages that they kidnapped. And they like robbers. They want ransoms. They want something in return. And as long as they are not ready to return them, there won't be an end to the war. There were negotiations. There are negotiations being held, I understand, behind the scenes, not on the screen, so I don't know. I don't see any reason to continue the war in Gaza if they really let all the prisoners go, those that they kept. It's civilians that were taken from their homes, from their beds, in an awful way. Some of them are already dead, some may be dying, so we need to do it quickly. But the other question is, who rules Gaza next? Is it Hamas again, or is there a way that the Palestinian leadership will have another option, which is more positive? The Palestinian Authority, which is quite weak, I have to admit, with help of maybe other Arab countries, maybe some other arrangement, but it's not only the military side of Hamas. Hamas does not accept the very existence of Israel. They say it openly, and they will not go for any agreement. So they should not be the rulers of Gaza, as far as one can say. Is there an option? I don't know. The government is not... I don't influence the government. I would try to include the Palestinian Authority, although they are not the strongest now. I think they are the address, with help of others, to rebuild a control and government in Gaza. We have left Gaza altogether almost 10 years ago, 9 years ago, 20 years ago, in 2005. And rather than making Gaza a paradise, they made it hell. And made it piled up arms and made it a launching pad for rockets against us. So if there is another leadership coming up, I would recommend the Palestinian Authority, and around it something to build. President Biden offered something like this. The Israeli government didn't like. Definitely Hamas doesn't like it. Is the situation now better for this? I don't know. Open question. But we should ask ourselves what comes next for Gaza after the war is over. Hopefully as soon as possible, and the hostages released and going back to the families. Those who are alive and those who are dead, unfortunately, the body should be brought back. This should be over, as it may be over in Lebanon. Hopefully, it seems better there. Then both countries, Lebanon, with all that happened there, and the Gaza area that is independent of Israel for over 20 years, needs to find a way to live peacefully and successfully for their own population and for their neighbors, including us.
Just lastly, sir, obviously there's 5 weeks left of the Biden administration, so I'm not sure whether Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, is going to be able to achieve a ceasefire deal before President Biden leaves office. Then, of course, comes President Trump with a new team. He's talked about his team taking shape. We've got this Middle East envoy who's sort of part of the family, Massad Boulos. He's got his ambassador for Israel lined up. What's your thinking when you see that team taking shape? What do you think it means for your country and for the region as a whole?
I'll tell you something that usually people and politicians don't like to say. The only true answer is, I have no clue. I knew what to expect for the Biden administration. I liked it. I didn't like it. It's all questions of my position, their position. Basically, I liked it. Trump offers all sorts of things. What will he make good and what not, and what these people will bring, I don't know. I think it's an open game. Hopefully, they will do the right thing. That is to say, stabilize the Middle East, back the more stable forces rather than the revolutionary forces, build a front to help the allies of America, Saudis, others, and Israel against the possible Iranian subversion. But then in the end, hopefully even find a way to live with the Iranians, who have their own right to live there, but not to turn the Middle East into chaos. So it's about policy in the Middle East. It's an important area for America, for the world, for all sorts of reasons. And there is, I think, will to try to stabilize it. And the forces that destabilize it caused this awful thing the last over a year, since October 7th, attack unprovoked. Nobody foresaw it coming. And then in one day, the Hezbollah joined in, although we have done nothing to them. And the whole thing went into chaos. And a lot of lives have been lost, a lot of destruction. And this is bad. So can we go back to normalcy? Not to normalize war, subversion, and terror, but to normalize normal life. America stands for this usually, and whether it's Biden or Trump or whoever the president is, I hope America will do whatever they can to help bring about a stable and peaceful Middle East.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time, sir. Former Israeli Deputy Prime Minister Dan Meredith. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Moving on now, an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. That is the overwhelming demand at the UN General Assembly votes. 158 out of 193 countries voted in favour of that motion. The US and Israel among the 9 countries that voted against, whilst 13 countries abstained. Well, the adopted resolution also calls for the urgent release of Israeli hostages, 96 of whom are still believed to be held by Hamas. Well, at the same session, 159 countries voted in support of the UN Palestinian Relief Agency, UNRWA, demanding that Israel not impede or restrict its operations in the besieged territory. Well, the votes are not binding, but reflect the global position of the year-long Israeli war. Meanwhile, Israel's ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, slammed the decision, claiming that UNRWA had been hopelessly infiltrated by Hamas, he said.
The UN and its members continue its obsession with Israel. For almost 80 years, you have perfected your obsession with blaming Israel while you blindly fund hatred and violence. By voting for these resolutions, you are not voting to protect humanitarian values, but to protect an organization that has become a haven for terror. You vote for the resolutions knowing the truth, knowing that UNRWA is not a neutral actor, but an entity hopelessly infiltrated by Hamas.
The Israeli ambassador to the UN, well, less than a day after the UN General Assembly session ended, Israeli strikes have been reported in Gaza, killing at least 35 Palestinians during the course of Thursday. Well, the death toll from the 14-month-long war has now reached 44,835 people in Gaza. That's according to the local health ministry. Well, for more, I'm joined now by the former Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East at the National Intelligence Council, Jonathan Panikoff. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Al Arabiya News. Let's start by talking about that UN General Assembly vote, which called for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza. It was rejected by the US and by Israel. Why?
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Look, I don't think the rejection is a surprise. The United States and Israel have consistently been voting against the resolutions. I think in their view, fundamentally, at the end of the day, they're not particularly helpful to getting toward a ceasefire. And I think we're now seeing U.S. officials back in the region with Qatari officials, Egyptian officials trying to really push toward that ceasefire. If anything, I think the reality is the timing of this resolution probably is not particularly helpful because you already have the political dynamics in Israel with a right-wing coalition that's going to be against almost any ceasefire deal. This probably doesn't do anything that's particularly helpful since it's not binding. I think the U.S. probably took that into consideration in a meaningful way and said, look, we need to just try to actually get to a ceasefire and not just have symbolic UN resolutions that are going to actually move us forward.
But even so, 158 votes to 9 with 13 abstentions. I mean, the United States and Israel in a very small club. And I'm just wondering whether this risks undermining U.S. standing in the region.
You know, look, I think that's a very fair point, but I'd also point out this is not the first UNGA Assembly resolution on this that's had similar margins. And look, in the United Nations Security Council, whether you agree or disagree, the U.S. has been 14-1, and the one holdout that rejected a number of the ceasefire resolutions for various reasons. It didn't mention the hostages, or it didn't condemn Hamas's actions on October 7th. Whatever the reason, I think certainly the standing of the United States over the last 14 months has taken a hit in the region. It's hard to think otherwise when you talk to folks, frankly, in the region, you spend time on the ground. I was in the Middle East much of the last 3 of the last 4 weeks, and you hear that and you feel that. I think the Biden administration also recognizes, look, that they're on their way out, and the best way that they can probably claw back some of their legacy is getting to a ceasefire, even if it means that they're still taking symbolic hits, as this resolution certainly would indicate.
Indeed, and there's been a flurry of diplomatic activity by the United States in this region, happening as we speak, in fact, because not only is Antony Blinken in Jordan, but the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has been holding talks with Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem today. I mean, do you think a ceasefire deal can be reached before President Biden leaves office?
I would say that I'm more optimistic certainly than I was a couple of weeks ago or even a month ago. And there's been a couple of factors that are driving this. Number one, frankly, the collapse of Hezbollah and the decision by Lebanon with Hezbollah's acquiescence to get into a separate deal with Israel for a ceasefire there, which has been tenuous but seemingly holding so far, has had a big impact because Nasrallah, before he was killed, had made very clear he would not agree to a ceasefire without one in Gaza first. That has gone by the wayside. Iran's exit from Syria and the position Iran is in, I think Hamas is increasingly more isolated. And that isolation, I think, is prompting them to be more inclined to a ceasefire than they were previously. On the Israeli side, I think Netanyahu recognizes with President Trump coming in, he's going to have much less flexibility. If he wants flexibility on Iran, if he wants flexibility and support for the direction he wants to go in a number of areas that are more important to him, frankly, and that especially means Iran and the longstanding place of Israel in the future in the region, he's going to have to be more willing to provide President Trump what he wants. And President Trump has been very clear. He fundamentally wants this to be done before, ceasefire to come before he enters office so that he's not entering with the conflict ongoing. I think those two factors have created a level of pressure on both sides that didn't exist before and makes me more optimistic that it can get done, though we're still quite a ways away.
Indeed. And of course, we've been looking, as you've been talking, at pictures of Gaza. There have been fresh strikes there today, at least 35 people killed during the course of this Thursday alone. I mean, just looking at the scenes of devastation across the Gaza Strip, 44,835 people killed. Most of them we understand to have been civilians. What is actually even left of Hamas at this point?
I think that's a really good question. I think the people I talk to are frustrated because it does feel like this is becoming increasingly more political by Prime Minister Netanyahu's side. From a security position, there's clearly reasons for Israel to want to have to stay or for an international force to come in because they're afraid of Hamas reconstituting. But at the very moment, look, Hamas's not just top level leadership, but it's frankly top 3 rungs of leadership have been decimated. Along with that, you've seen a massive decrease in Hamas's weapons inventory. Their ability to strike Israel still does exist, but it's so reduced from where we were even 6 months ago that I think that there's fundamentally not much left. And so I think that's why you see even folks in the Israeli security establishment calling that we are long past the need time to get the hostages out, and that requires a ceasefire. And that means that, yes, there will be still some Hamas remnants, some other terrorist organizations, including Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who have members who are still running around. But at this point, the idea that Hamas poses even close to the same threat to Israel that they did on October 7th is just fundamentally untrue.
And we've been talking about the enormous shifts in the Middle East during these last couple of months. I mean, the departure of Bashar al-Assad has taken most of the guests we've had on this channel by surprise, the speed at which it happened at any rate. Israel now carrying out these airstrikes right across Syria. Do you think Washington supports them?
I think Washington supports them, and I think, to be honest, I think quietly a number of governments in the region support them. I think one thing that you don't want, it's so unclear who is going to emerge in Syria with power. There's so many groups. It's not just HTS. You have a possibility of fragmentation, and you don't want to end up in a Libya-like scenario in which some of these groups, including ISIS and al-Qaeda fragments, have access to what were remaining chemical weapons or to real ships and ballistic missiles of the Assad regime. So I think those types of strikes actually are quite meaningful. What's not particularly helpful is the decision by Netanyahu to stand on Mount Hermon in the Golan Heights and brag about this, frankly. I think that was done for domestic political consumption, and it makes it harder and undermines, I think, the public narrative, because then you've got no choice but for a number of Syrian opposition groups to understandably say, we are vehemently opposed. What is being done is completely inappropriate, must stop immediately, is illegal, even if they too are concerned about some of these weapons falling into the wrong hands.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at recent history, there are so many bad scenarios to choose from in terms of which direction Syria could end up going in. But listening to what we've heard from the new leadership in Damascus so far and looking at the situation from the outside, are you hopeful about the future of Syria?
I honestly am among those who just doesn't know where it's going to be. There are moments I'm hopeful and moments I'm quite nervous. I think there's certainly a possibility, and my hope is, like I think most people, that you get to a place of stability and broader control. You have agreements between a number of the various factions, and you don't end up in a position where the entire state is fragmented into a Libya-like scenario. The chances of that happening, I think, are much greater the quicker that everybody can coalesce in the international community, provide support, and can coalesce behind whatever leadership emerges. The longer it takes, 6 months, 9 months, a year, 2 years, it's going to get harder and harder for that to happen. And people will end up grabbing onto power in their territorial areas where they have the most control, trying to minorly expand them. And then you're really in a situation where you could have an elongated conflict that's not just two sides, but could be, frankly, 4, 5, 6 different sides. And I think that's incredibly bad for Syria and the Syrian people who have suffered for so much and so long. Bashar Al-Assad's ouster is a phenomenal thing for them and potentially for the region. But I think the international community has to work quite hard and quite quickly to make sure that this moves into a direction that's positive for the future of Syria, the Syrian people, and the region.
Indeed, and as we've been saying, just a few weeks left of the Biden administration and the return of Donald Trump to the White House. He's announced his Middle East envoy, Massad Boulos, whose job is now looking increasingly complicated. But at the same time, I'm just wondering, lastly, and looking forwards, I mean, do you see that there's a real opportunity as far as Washington is concerned for bringing some stability, some lasting stability to this particular region of the Middle East?
Like everyone, I certainly hope so. And Boulos is going to be doing this in somewhat of a conjunction with another individual, Steve Witkoff, who is a real estate developer and is going to be charged with kind of expanding really the Abraham Accords and facilitating peace. I think the two of them are probably a good tag team. Boulos knows the region quite well, but they both come from the business community. And so you're talking about people who, like President-elect Trump, fundamentally want to see a deal cut in order to increase stability for the region and frankly, for the world. I think the challenges, obviously, are greater than they were even a month ago. But the Trump administration has quite a lot of credibility in the Middle East. It's the opposite, frankly, of where they stand in Europe. And so I think that there are opportunities, but it's really going to come down to, are they able to shape events, or events, frankly, going to drive them? Right? Is there going to be increased hostilities with Iran, which then implicates the Gulf states? Or are you going to be able to move on and actually get some sort of deal that the Biden administration was unable to get of the last few years? I think Syria, Libya, Sudan, if we go further away, are all going to play into these questions. But obviously, there's some overarching concern about Iran and then the broader terrorist threat that could emanate Al-Qaeda, ISIS from Syria if it's not controlled completely. And that's going to drive the region forward.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Jonathan Panikoff, thanks again.
Thank you.
Now, the FBI Director, Christopher Wray, has announced his resignation. Well, he was behind one of the Bureau's largest investigations, notably the probe into the January 6th U.S. Capitol attack. Well, Wray says that his resignation will take effect at the end of the Biden administration next month. Well, his investigation into the Capitol attack led to the arrest of more than 1,500 people who were accused of breaking the law. Well, US President-elect Donald Trump had signaled his intent to fire him anyway and replace him with Kash Patel. Well, Wray still had 3 years remaining of his 10-year term at the helm of the FBI. Well, in a Truth Social post, Donald Trump responded saying that Wray's resignation will, quote, end the weaponization of what has become known as the United States Department of Injustice. Well, the relationship between Trump and Wray soured after he left the White House in 2021. He accused Wray and the FBI of carrying out investigations for political reasons. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Professor David K. Johnson, who is a former New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and now professor of practice at Rochester Institute of Technology. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. The FBI Director Chris Wray is supposed to have a 10-year term, meaning he still has a couple of years left. Why has he resigned now?
Well, Donald Trump was going to fire him anyway. The law requires he have cause. There is no cause to fire him, and I think Wray decided the Bureau will be better off if he doesn't put it through the turmoil of fighting for his last 3 years. It's probably also not inconsequential that he'll go back to a law practice that was paying him about $1 million a month.
Okay, so he's probably not going to get a pay cut by switching back to the legal world. But how rare is it for an FBI director to leave before their 10-year term is up?
Oh, this is a rather extraordinary development, particularly because the 10-year term was put in place so that we wouldn't have politicized directors. Now, Kash Patel, Donald Trump's choice, is a fierce Trump loyalist and has made it clear he's going to go after FBI agents who worked on the investigations of Donald Trump's crimes, especially the national security documents that Trump illegally took to his Mar-a-Lago home in Florida.
Yeah, and Wray would say he was simply doing his job, wasn't he?
Yes, and in fact, he was doing his job. But Donald Trump is someone who I've covered for 36 years and who believes that he is unique, that he is above the law, he is uniquely qualified, even though he's utterly unqualified. And Donald creates his own reality. He lives in this fictional world in his head, and that's why he's so adaptable to things. He just makes it up. And unfortunately, a lot of otherwise sane human beings join in his fantasies.
Okay, I mean, the United States faces some pretty serious challenges, doesn't it? Namely, confronting...
Oh, it does. And a particular concern here is that the FBI has two functions. One is traditional crime, a bank robbery, drug trafficking, things like that. But half of its mission is counterintelligence. And Kash Patel has suggested that he is very hostile to this role of counterintelligence. I suspect that the Five Eyes program, that's the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, in sharing intelligence will be deeply challenged because the other members of the Five Eyes group are not going to openly share a lot of intelligence out of concern that it may end up in Moscow.
Okay, and as you say, you know, some pretty important issues for the FBI to be focused on, notably espionage, terrorism, violent crime you mentioned as well. I mean, this isn't all about Donald Trump. What's best for the United States? What's best for US security? Should Chris Wray, therefore, stay in his job?
Well, Christopher Wray, who Trump appointed, has actually done quite a good job. I was skeptical of him when he was appointed, but he has demonstrated significant management skill. There certainly have been some missteps. In an organization with 45,000 people, you shouldn't be surprised that individual agents here and there have acted improperly. But overall, they've done a very good job. They have thwarted numerous terrorist attacks and compromised a number of cells of people who were sent to the U.S. to do harm.
And, you know, if Christopher Wray leaves under a cloud and the perception that it's perhaps unfair and that, you know, the whole point of these 10-year terms, as you said, was to minimize the chances of partisanship in the 4-year political cycle. I mean, do you think that could result in, you know, a real nosedive in morale in the ranks of the FBI and therefore greater risk to U.S. national security?
Yes, I think you're going to see some very experienced and senior FBI officials decide it's time to take retirement and go somewhere else. Kash Patel announced that I think he was being dramatic, not literal, but he said that when he takes charge, he's going to instantly shut down the FBI headquarters in Washington and send the 7,000 people who work there out to work as cops. Well, of course, that's where you manage. It's where you have forensics and analysis and supervision. Nobody runs a large organization without management at the top to direct the use of resources and decide which cases you're going to pursue. Secondly, Trump has made it very clear that he expects the FBI and the Justice Department to go after people he perceives as enemies. And I may well be on his list. We don't know who they're going to go after. But that's not what law enforcement is supposed to do. That's what law enforcement does in a society like the one in Syria, where the dictator was just overthrown.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about Kash Patel, and while you were talking about him as well, we saw some pictures of him there on the screen. You know, not a figure that's known perhaps to a wide international audience, simply because he hasn't actually even worked at the FBI before, as far as I'm aware. And I'm just wondering, assuming he's confirmed, what's he likely to bring to the table as the head of the FBI?
Well, yeah, Patel has a glancing familiarity with federal law enforcement. He was a prosecutor at one time, but none of the chops that you would expect to run the FBI. And his overwhelming reputation, what's in the book that he wrote and his speeches, is that he is there as Donald Trump's attack dog, his personal attack dog. And he intends, he has said, to carry out what Donald Trump wants. That's not what you should expect of the head of the largest and most important law enforcement agency in the United States, the U.S. Justice Department, and the FBI, the investigating arm of the U.S. Justice Department. But I think that's what we're going to see. I think people, after all, Donald Trump has said that he wants members of Congress jailed, even though they're immune, and he knows he can't do that. He wants military officers purged from the ranks. And he wants to eliminate a great many jobs of people who are professional public servants.
Indeed, he wants to reshape the entire U.S. government, doesn't he?
Yes. Well, I think he actually wants to destroy it. One of my 3 books on Donald Trump documents his efforts in the first administration to destroy the federal government as it's known. He was successful in a few areas, but Donald is not a good manager. He's a con artist, and he operates from bluff and bluster. So the first time around, he didn't have nearly the success I think he will this time, because he's got a whole group of people who are, in some cases, very competent managers and are serious ideologues. And of course, he has a plan called Project 2025, which during the campaign he claimed he knew nothing about, even though he had blessed it when the project began. And now Trump and his surrogates are all saying, well, of course, that was our plan.
Indeed. And I just want to go back just briefly to talking about Kash Patel, because a comment that we saw from John Bolton, who has spoken to us here a couple of times at Al Arabiya News, he compared Patel's appointment to the sorts of appointments that we saw made by Stalin when he appointed his chief of the secret police. I mean, how widely shared do you think a view like that is in the corridors of power in Washington?
Well, I think there's a lot of concern and skepticism in Washington, but Donald Trump has made it clear that any Republican senator, and the senators have to approve many of his appointees, including the head of the Justice Department and the FBI, that if they don't go along with him, he will find candidates to run against them in the next election and end their careers. Now, more than 1 million people have died for the United States of America. My father was a 100% disabled veteran of World War II. If you don't have the courage to risk losing your elected position, I don't think you should be holding public office. And as to John Bolton, I don't see the world at all the way John Bolton does, but I respect that he is a serious, competent professional. No concerns about him being a national security advisor to a president. And I would weigh heavily his words about how Kash Patel is utterly unfit.
Just going back to Christopher Wray, We're approaching the end of this interview, but Donald Trump appointed him, of course, in 2017. And Chris Wray, if I'm not mistaken, is a lifelong Republican. So you'd have thought, these two men with conservative views ought to have seen eye to eye on a number of issues, but it seems they didn't. I mean, do you think in terms of where it went wrong in that relationship, it was simply about the probes that the FBI carried out into January 6th and the handling of documents by Donald Trump?
Well, I couldn't hear quite all of your question, Tom, but only Republicans have led the FBI since its creation more than a century ago. And FBI agents have risked their lives. Some of them have been killed. Some of them work overseas. But there's a large component that is very focused on issues of national security. And Donald Trump, during his first weeks in his first term, gave away serious U.S. national security secrets, what are known as sources and methods. Who told us that and how we found it out? In a secret meeting with the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and Russian Ambassador Kislyak, a meeting we only know about because the Russians announced it. Trump never did. And so I think there's grave reason to be concerned that under Kash Patel, the FBI will not be doing the kind of job it has under Christopher Wray and his predecessors dealing with American national security.
Just lastly, you've mentioned, and we know from having spoken to you before, that you've written extensively about Donald Trump. You've written books about him. Just want to get your reaction to the news that he's been named as the Time Magazine Person of the Year.
Well, Time Magazine has always said that its Person of the Year is not an approval or disapproval. It's a recognition of who was the most significant news figure. And I think you can make a very good case that in 2024, Donald Trump's comeback makes him the most significant person in the news anywhere in the world.
Okay, well, it seems like they've got a good argument there in that case. Well, thank you very much for your time. Professor David K. Johnson, thank you.
Tom.
Well, staying in the United States, businesses are scrambling to protect their senior managers as police warn of an elevated near-term threat against C-suite executives. Well, in the days since Luigi Mangione was charged with murder for gunning down the top health insurance executive Brian Thompson, wanted posters with the faces of CEOs have begun appearing on walls in New York. Well, the posters feature words deny, depose, defend. Now, that's a slogan that was found carved into the bullets that killed Thompson last week. Well, the posters accuse the executives of denying medical care and favouring corporate profit. Well, let's get more analysis now. We can speak to our correspondent in New York, Sally Patterson. Sally, thank you very much indeed for joining us. The evidence associated with Luigi Mangione, the man charged with the killing of the CEO of United Healthcare, it's looking pretty compelling, isn't it?
Well, we are hearing more and more details about what police are finding as part of their investigation into the killing of Brian Thompson just over a week ago now. Now, we have heard on Thursday that some shell casing found at the scene of the crime appears to match a gun that was carried by the suspect in this case, Luigi Mangione. There's also evidence to suggest, police say, that DNA testing also appears to link the suspect to the crime, and we are hearing more details each day that goes on. I will say, of course, at this point that Luigi Mangione's lawyer says he plans to plead not guilty both here in New York and to the charges he's facing over in Pennsylvania. Now, what we're seeing here in New York City, just a few minutes from where the shooting took place last Wednesday, is posters popping up across the city. And what they are is wanted posters featuring the faces of the CEOs of other healthcare insurance bosses. So we've got various pictures with quotes as well, saying things like United Healthcare killed everyday people for the sake of profit. As a result, it says Brian Thompson was denied his claim to life. Who will be denied yet? Now, the New York Police Department is concerned that that could lead to copycat behavior with other acts of violence taking place across the city. That has been condemned, as has the glorification of this killing on social media and in real life as well, with people turning up with these posters and also holding placards appearing to celebrate the death of Thompson.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary story, isn't it? A massive amount of public interest, a huge amount of media attention, lots of conspiracy theories. There's also an online fundraiser for his legal defence. I mean, this is all pretty unprecedented, isn't it?
That's right. Some fundraising websites have raised $31,000 as of Wednesday, supporting Mangione and his legal battles here. And what we're hearing from analysts throughout this case, and also from legal experts here, is that, as I say, he seems to have been almost made into this martyr-type figure. It shows a real dissatisfaction with the healthcare system here in the US, with many people feeling that it is simply broken and is really benefiting from the ill health of those at the very bottom, those on the lowest wages. And what we're hearing is that this shooting, which has shocked people here and around the world, is actually a sort of almost a long time coming, many people here feel, because there is so much resentment and anger towards this insurance system, which makes billions and billions of dollars every year. Now, that has, of course, been condemned by lawmakers here. We've heard the White House strongly condemn any sort of glorification of this act of violence. We also heard from Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, who said that this man, whoever was behind this shooting, is not a martyr, but this is unacceptable. They said that Thompson left behind his family, he left behind 2 children, and this is not something to be celebrated. But what the other thing that this shows, this case, is just how much impact social media can have. We have seen so much coming out online, whether it's memes coming out, whether it's the mugshots of the suspect being circulated, and also conspiracy theories as well, linking various potential motives to the shooting that took place. The anonymity of people online is also something that's been pointed to here. People able to put out threats from the safety of their bedrooms under the disguise of being online and unable to be traced. Also, people combing through the social media accounts of the suspect in this case to make their own analysis. Now, of course, I will reiterate that the suspect plans to plead not guilty to all of the charges against him, according to his lawyer.
Indeed. I mean, it's an unprecedented case, as you've been saying, for so many different reasons, not just one. But let's just wrap up by taking a closer look at who the man is at the centre of all of this. Just tell us a little bit more about who 26-year-old Luigi Mangione is.
Well, Luigi Mangione grew up in Baltimore in the state of Maryland. By all accounts, he appears to have had a relatively well-off background. He went to a private all-boys school in Baltimore. He then went on to the University of Pennsylvania, where he received both an undergraduate and a master's degree in computer science. And we've been hearing from his friends, roommates at universities, who've all said that this has been a shocking incident and they didn't see him as a violent person at all. We've also heard from people who he spent extracurricular time with. He went off to a surfing retreat in the state of Hawaii, and people there also said that this was completely unexpected from a man that they had known during that time. Now, what we also understand is that Mangione had a back injury, and it really left him completely debilitated, and that seemed to have changed his life quite dramatically. And there are reports that that could be linked to his motive as to what allegedly then led him to take part in this incident. But of course, we're going to have to wait for police lines to be sure of what really happened. But there is certainly a sense that this was a man who seemed to be doing very well in his life, who seemed to then really lose contact with his friends and family. There are social media accounts coming out of people who seem to be his friends saying, "We can't get hold of you, you're supposed to be coming to my wedding and we can't hear from you." And so he seems to have really gone off grid in the months leading up to this shooting. And I'm sure as police give us more details and prosecutors really get into the details of this case, we'll understand more about the 26-year-old who has been charged with murder of Brian Thompson.
OK, Sally Patterson, our correspondent in New York, thank you very much for your update. Well, in the wake of the police investigation, as we were just hearing there from our correspondent in New York, wanted CEO posters have started popping up on the streets of New York. Well, to talk to us more about what's going on, we can speak to Michael Tabman, former FBI special agent. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael. I just want to start by establishing with you what you understand as having been the motive for the death of 50-year-old Brian Thompson. Why was he targeted and killed?
Well, I think based on what's being presented to the public, the motivation is clear. It's a frustration with the insurance industry and the lack of perceived responsiveness to the care of their patients. And as seen by the social media response and support for the alleged shooter, that's obviously a sentiment shared by most Americans.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard people saying things like denying healthcare coverage to people is murder. I mean, it really sounds like this case has struck a very raw nerve in the United States.
I think striking a raw nerve are the exact correct words. This guy has become sort of a Robin Hood now. Again, I understand the frustration, but I didn't see that coming, that he'd be hailed as a hero. So that really actually makes it, in a sense, almost a successful terrorist attempt. Domestic terrorism is, intimidating a group of people, civilians, the government, in order to affect some sort of institutional change. And right now we have people talking about changes with the insurance industry, though through fear. And I never want to see this happen in the United States again. But it is struck a chord. It struck a chord with the American people. It struck a chord with the insurance industry. And I think what will be interesting now is, while prosecutors generally rely on presenting the compelling evidence in a case, when this comes to trial, if it does, they have to be concerned now, can they get 12 jurors, none of whom are going to have any sympathy for the suspect?
Indeed. And it's extraordinary, as we were saying just before we crossed you, that these posters have been popping up, these wanted posters of senior executives from corporate America. People saying things online like healthcare CEOs should not feel safe. I mean, when you hear things like that, do you think that there are some real implications for the safety of senior individuals in corporate America?
Right. If I understood you correctly, because I'm not hearing you well, you were asking if there was a real danger to other healthcare CEOs. Was that the question?
Exactly.
Okay, yeah. Definitely there is. Well, first of all, with this case, you always have, as with other shootings or high-profile crimes, we always have the danger of the copycat. So that's the danger in and of itself. And then you, of course, have this heroic lionization that social media has presented to the suspect, and others who are extremists, who are on the precipice of committing violence in the name of some perceived wrong, will take this as motivation, saying, hey, I could be a hero too. I'll be praised, in the media and social media. I'll get 500,000 followers, and I'll probably, get off because the public supports me. So yes, from two fronts, copycat, but yes, but also the motivation to be, the next Robin Hood out there. So I would say that, at least for the time being, CEOs, high-profile individuals in the healthcare or other related industries need to be extremely cautious.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the sort of folklore element of the suspect here, and there's even Free Luigi merchandise being sold by some people. And when you talk about corporate executives having to rethink how they live, their security arrangements, I mean, what sort of steps can companies take on behalf of their senior management to ensure that they're not targets themselves?
For example, I remember when I was a special agent in charge of the FBI, which was almost 20 years ago, I met with CEOs of high-profile companies individually, for lunch, sometimes at social events, and they never traveled with a security team. And now I understand this CEO did have a security team, so clearly that threat may be changing. But a security team obviously is important. Awareness, just like we ask everyone to do for these guys leaving the house, look for something suspicious, any phone calls, knocks on the door, any anybody asking about them, they should report to their security or to law enforcement. Obviously, home security, beware of home invasions or someone breaking in. Nothing out of the ordinary that we haven't heard of, but mostly being aware of their surroundings in addition to what we call hard target protection, security details and alarm systems. Being aware of the situation, knowing where he's going, knowing who he's meeting, understanding the exits to a place in case of emergency, understanding how to respond with a security team if there's a threat, training and practicing that. So all the normal things that a security consultant would advise them on to do.
I mean, when you look at the profile of Luigi Mangione, 26-year-old, we were just talking to our correspondent in New York who said, he came from what by all accounts sounded like a loving family, intelligent, educated, lots of privileges. Is there anything in his profile that you've seen up until this point? And I'm sure you're party to only media reports about him, but is there anything you've seen or read or heard that to you sounds like a red flag?
Well, nothing that we would have discovered prior to the shooting, such as his manifesto, which clearly is consistent with other shooters that we've seen, mass shooters, school shooters. 9 times out of 10, you'll hear people say, oh, I just didn't see this coming. He didn't show any signs of that. Or, yeah, he spoke about it, but it certainly didn't sound like him. We didn't consider that to be a real threat. So in that sense that we didn't see that in him, or his friends didn't see his family, that's consistent with what we've seen in other shooters. But the manifesto, the internal agonizing over whatever they believe their grievance is, that's also consistent, but we have to know about it. So the question now will be, was there any leakage? And I'm sure we've heard that term quite often. Is anybody, his friends or family, going to say, yes, now that I think back, he said this, or he made some sort of comment, or was fascinated with some sort of story about a shooting? That would be some indication. But it's very easy to look at that in hindsight and make the connection. While it's happening, a comment or some fascination with the story from someone we love or care for or are with often is hard to detect as leakage of an act this violent and this overt.
This is my last question to you, Michael. Just to sum it all up, do you think this could perhaps be summarized as having been an example of the widening sense of inequality in U.S. society, or would you say that was an oversimplification?
No, I think it is an example of the frustration growing in the United States, a divisiveness in this country, which is certainly well documented in the news and is known worldwide. The element of violence has been thrown into our lifestyle here. There are those who condone violence, those who minimize violence when it happens, if it fits their political narrative. So I think while as upsetting as this is, I don't find it that surprising in the sense of where we have been heading in the United States for some time now.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you for your time. Michael Tabman, former FBI special agent. Thanks again.
Hey, thank you.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Hello and welcome to Al Arabiya News. I'm your host, Michal Prendergast. I'm thrilled to say I'm joined by the star of Shark Tank USA and millionaire investor, Kevin O'Leary. So, Kevin, the world has been shocked about the return of Donald Trump. Are you shocked?
No. The Democratic Party lost its way. They're no longer in touch with the electorate. There was a certain arrogance they had, and I think the problem started when Biden left the ticket, because in the democratic process, usually you have a convention, and so you start from scratch, and that process weeds out any weakness in candidates. If they have an inability to articulate their position, for example, or they're not able to debate their colleagues or whatever. But the other advantage of the convention, and there's been many very famous conventions back as far as the 40s, 50s, and 60s, is that the party realigns itself with a new message because it's trying to figure out what's the best candidate for the times. And they also get a tremendous amount of press, almost 5-6 weeks of press. That's not what happened here. What occurred was, I don't know if you want to call them the party elite, but the Pelosi's, the Schumers, the Obama,
the deep
even
state,
some movie stars, you know, they said, well, we're going to anoint Harris. And that was a mistake because Harris, well, a very fine person, I'm sure, has never won anything. And last time she tried this, she didn't get a single delegate. So in 2020, in 2019, she failed. 2020, she failed. She failed again in 2024. The analogy I think that is best serving this thing is the Super Bowl of all political contests on earth is the American presidential election. There's no greater political event on earth. And if your quarterback gets injured, which is what Biden was, you don't put in a new quarterback that's never played a game or ever won one, ever. They got shellacked, and they've learned an important lesson. I looked at that map, the electoral map, while covering the election. It was turning redder than a lobster being boiled. I mean, he just took the nation. And I think they're doing a little soul searching now. But they had it coming to them. And as I like to say, Trump did them a huge favor. He actually helped that party. They don't know it yet, but they're going to have to take a spatula to it and scrape all of those candidates away and start from scratch with new leadership. They'll be a very competitive party. There's a lot of talent in the Democratic Party that never got a chance to compete. Now they will.
Yeah, and speaking of Donald Trump, I've heard you say every Democrat has to thank him for saving American entrepreneurship and the American economy.
Yeah, the concept, some of the ideas being proposed, specifically taxing unrealized gains, that's un-American. The idea of price controls, Soviet-style price controls, that's un-American. The focus on gender identity was not the #1 concern of people that can't even afford chicken on their kitchen table. So when you get that lost, the system corrects itself, and that's exactly what happened. That's the amazing thing about democracy. When you try and stretch it too far in any direction, boom, it self-corrects. Now, you happen to be in the way of the self-correction, you get decimated, and that's what happened to that party.
Yes, and the effect of social media has been really interesting. Obviously, Elon Musk has played a huge part. Obviously, he paid it $44 billion. Do you see that as a good investment in the future of free speech?
Well, as an investment, it wasn't a good investment because it's valued now at 11 to 12 billion. But that doesn't matter. What he did do is keep alive the concept of free speech, because in a democracy, you're always dealing with 2.5% lunatic fringe. The cost of freedom of speech is the lunatic fringe. The minute you try and shut down the lunatic fringe, you're moving away from the concept freedom of speech. Everybody has a voice. You may not like what they say, but because they're part of the narrative, that is the core and the DNA of democracy. And so many ideas get tested, some get thrown out. And when you try and change that, again, the system self-corrects, and that's what happened here. So it's a very divided country now. We are going to have a new president with a full mandate. I mean, it looks like he's going to win the Senate and the House and the presidency. You can get a lot done for the first 2 years when you control everything. And so that's what's going to happen.
And obviously Trump in his first 4 years, it might have been called a little inexperienced. I think this time he won't mess around.
Well, he's actually signaled the market that he intends to hire seasoned veterans, AAA players, that don't have a mandate to go in the White House and write a book 6 weeks later after they're fired. He doesn't want that. He doesn't want a rotating door anymore. He wants A players, and he's grooming his, he's got some very interesting people working on the inside to find the right people for every single position in cabinet. And I think it's going to be a fantastic government because it's going to focus on what the people want. They want security at the border. They've already said that. They want a reduction in inflation. The way you do that is you reduce energy costs. They want to strip away all the regulatory environment that the Biden administration put on. $1 trillion worth of burdensome regulation. He will tear that off like a Band-Aid, rip it right off, and the economy, as you can see, indexed by the market, the buoyancy that happened as soon as they figured out that he was going to be president, was pretty happy with that outcome. This is good for business. And when the economy is buoyant and people are getting employed, it's good for everybody. So, you know, the Democrats are licking their wounds, but in 6 weeks, everybody forget about it, and we'll move on. It'll be a great thing for everybody. I think the U.S. is in a renaissance period. And I'm not really shilling for politicians. I never do that. I shill for policy. I care about policy. I care about entrepreneurship. I care about investing. I care about the American dream. I'm an ambassador for it. I want that to work because my family, you know, is American and they're working in the U.S. I want the best we can get for that country every day. And this is how you do it.
And speaking in terms of efficiency, Elon Musk has famously, he sacked or he got rid of 85% of Twitter, and it's still running pretty flawlessly. There's been a lot of speculation that he might get the Secretary of State for Government Efficiency. Would you like to see that? What could someone like Elon Musk do in terms of saving tax dollars?
I don't think he'll take an actual specific role in cabinet. I think what he will do is be a consultant for the American people, identify inefficiencies, and get the whacking stick out. I love that idea. I love the idea that we've never really scraped the fat out of the federal government, and it's big, porky, fat, dripping with opportunity to cut. But the only way you can do that is you need a mandate from the top dog, the president, because no agency wants to be downsized. You walk in saying, I want to fire a third of you. They're not going to help you. But he'll identify opportunity. I call it release the hounds. Because what taxpayer, regardless of what your politics are, red or blue or independent, who wouldn't want to save money by just chopping out all the waste in the federal government? And I think if there's one man that has the ability to do that, proven executional skills, it's Elon Musk. So I really endorse this idea.
Well, I think it could be a great team, obviously, with Donald Trump and the art of the deal. To speak on the international scale, with tariffs, obviously it's a word that Trump has bandied around a lot. What does that mean for, I suppose, the average Joe in America and for the future of international trade? We're looking at China, we're looking at EV production. What do Trump's tariffs mean?
So tariffs were used as a form of rhetoric, weaponry during the election cycle. Harris called them sales tax, like a VAT tax that we have in Europe. That's not what they are. In fact, there's a bill cruising around the Hill right now in the U.S. It's a tariff reciprocal act. And what it says is any of our trading partners that impose tariffs will put a reciprocal, identical tariff. So if Germany puts 10% on cars, we'll put 10% on their cars coming to the U.S., that kind of thing. And of course, you know, there's a new act, the new NAFTA 2.0, if you want to call it that governs Canada, the United States, and Mexico, big trading partners. The one entity that I think you're going to see a lot more pressure on is China. China doesn't abide by the rules of the WTO. They joined in 1999 with all kinds of promises to play by the rules. They never did. So I'm an advocate for using tariffs to squeeze their heads like teenage pimples. And the way I make that is, point that out, is to say, look, the only way a supreme leader stays in power perpetually is everybody has bread and butter. You have to have a job. Otherwise, you riot against the supreme leader. And that's just the way it is in a communist dictatorship. So the way you squeeze the supreme leader's head is you say, look, let's pick a sector. I'm just going to use an example. Yoga mats. Let's say the U.S. orders 1 million yoga mats a week from China. You put a 400% tariff on it. And all the people making yoga mats in China lose their jobs. And they don't have any bread and butter anymore. And the supreme leader goes, oh my goodness, I don't have any jobs for these yoga mat makers. And then you say, well, where else can we inflict some damage? Let's do it in this sector. Put on 400% tariff there, squeezing that teenage pimple till it pops. Then he gets on an airplane and flies to Washington saying, just kidding, just kidding. I want to work out and be part of the, Reciprocal Tariff Act. Because China only understands the stick. They don't understand anything else.
It's a game of chicken.
Well, Trump scares his adversaries because he's unpredictable. He's just very unpredictable. When you know what your adversary is going to do all the time and they signal it to you beforehand, you're not scared of him anymore. They're scared shitless of Trump. And that's, excuse my French, but that's basically how it works. That's why you're seeing all these guys saying, oh, we want to have peace now. No, we want to stop. Because he's very unpredictable. So in the case of China, squeezing the supreme leader to the table is a good thing. So I would like to go to 400% tariffs. Because I do business in China. They don't play by the rules.
And how about on EVs? Because obviously, even a 20% or even a 30% tariff on EVs, I believe in the EU, they're trying to flood the market. Obviously, Germany's not happened. We've seen Volkswagen cut 1,000 jobs in 2 months ago.
The point is, tariffs are temporary. They're a negotiating tactic. But if you're going to put them on, don't screw around. Go to 400%. Make it impossible for them to sell any widgets anywhere. So if you put 400% on an EV, no one's going to buy it. Only the Chinese can buy it. So all the people making the EVs, no bread, no butter. That's how you do it. Now, if I was the minister of Chinese head squeezing, that's how I would do it. And believe me, they will be at the table so fast because they cannot afford to have unemployment in that economy. And it's showing some cracks there. So you want to hit them while they're down and bring them to the table. They cheat on IP, they steal, you can't use their courts. A good example that people should focus on is Twitter, or not Twitter, but TikTok. TikTok has been deemed Chinese spyware by the American Congress. That's a bipartisan bill. By midnight on Jan 19th in the U.S., the servers are going to get turned off.
I've heard you say as well that you would like to buy it via a consortium. Do you want to buy Twitter?
Yeah,
TikTok?
I would definitely buy TikTok. I would buy it because it's a great. It depends what I get with it. If I don't get the algorithm, all I'm getting is a mailing list, so I'd pay a lot less for that. But we'll see how this goes because remember they did this in India. After 4 years, they had 200 million users on it, and the supreme leader would not, play by the rules with the Indian government, and they said, we'll just turn it off. And everybody was squeamish for a week, and then they forgot about it. They just drifted onto other social media platforms. So, again, squeezing the supreme leader's head there is good. And it is spyware. I would never put that on a phone that I have sensitive data on. It's Chinese spyware. Everybody knows that. That's why it's shut down. They just shut it down in Canada. I mean, they're going to shut it down everywhere. But this is the arrogance of the supreme leader. He doesn't care. So you've got to squeeze his head. He will appreciate the head squeezing. He will thank you for it.
And is it the same, obviously, with the likes of Vladimir Putin and the war between Israel and Hamas? War is not good for business. Do you think Trump is going to have a large enough impact? He said famously, I will stop the wars within the first day of office. Do you think that's true?
Putin understands force. Not a very nice guy. He's killed a lot of people. But 25,000 young Russians a month lose their lives. He's buying their services now. There's no more patriots left. You get coffin money, your family gets a house, but you go die or get blown up. That's pretty brutal. So I would think giving him a call and saying, look, I've been thinking about this war. I don't like it. I don't want to pay for the Ukrainian costs, and I want it to stop. Come to the table, or I'll do something that will really surprise you, which is probably what people worry about with Trump, because we saw how he ended the Syrian conflict by just saying, I'm going to kill this guy. And he did. And I think that kind of erratic nature is what these adversaries worry about. Now, a lot of NATO players don't like to hear this, but I think war's horrible. I think all these people and children losing their lives is horrible. It's just, somebody has to stop this.
Exactly, and on a human level, but as well as
obviously
markets. So it affects the bread and butter as well. So you're taking food off of people's tables, affecting jobs, as well as the human suffering. It's bad all around.
It is. So I think people are willing to try a different way. Now, whether it's Trump successful or not, we'll see. But this carnage of death of young children, I can't watch it anymore. No one can.
Of course.
It's got to stop.
Then, moving on to cryptocurrency, we've seen markets as well as the price of Bitcoin increase. It broke $72,000, I believe, in the past few days. Do you believe under Trump, what is the height that you think it can get to under a Trump presidency?
So Trump has signaled, and the market knows this, that he is in favor of digital payment system, which includes Bitcoin, which is an asset class. I'm not saying that's a digital payment system, but it's no different than gold. I mean, you can own some gold, you can own some Bitcoin. I own both. What the problem is, we don't have institutional support for it yet because it's not regulated in the U.S. The way other commodities are. So the rumor on the street is that the CFTC, which regulates commodities, is going to get the mandate for crypto, and they're looking for someone to run it. And they'll probably take a lot of that away from Gensler at the SEC, who's been litigating this sector, and successfully, I might add. He's, all the crypto cowboys, like Binance, CZ, he's a felon now. You know what happened to Sam Bankman-Fried. So people that took on Gensler all lost, and this is probably a good thing. So we move into a phase now where it's going to be regulated. There's a lot of optimism about it. Here in Abu Dhabi, we have the M2 exchange, which is a very interesting idea because it's completely compliant with its regulator. I see a lot of upside coming in crypto.
And a figure, just briefly, do you think, what's the limit? Do you think it can reach
I think
200K under a Trump presidency?
I think we'll all see 100,000 shortly. I feel everybody should have 5% weighting in gold in their portfolio. Nothing wrong with 5% weighting in Bitcoin. I mean, why not? I mean, unless you really think, and you don't have to do this, I'm just saying alternative asset classes in times of uncertainty and inflation are good. I mean, I own gold and I've had it my whole life. I was given a locket from my Irish father when I was 11 years old that had a gold coin in it. That's when I fell in love with it. I've had that ever since. And I own bullion, I own ETFs. I mean, gold is gold. The Romans loved it, I love it. Bitcoin is the new. It's not as old as gold, but it's performed very well for me.
Yeah. And just lastly, speaking on gold, obviously to have Kevin O'Leary, Mr. Wonderful in the studio, it would be a shame if I didn't ask about watches. You are, I would say, the most famous watch collector in the world now, doing millions of views on YouTube every month with the likes of Teddy Baldassar. He has just opened his new watch shop. I want to ask you, would you ever think of entering the watch strap business? The red bands are... They're synonymous with you.
It's a great question, but what I've learned about watch collecting and getting access, I mean, the thing that in my journey into horology is, in order to get watchmakers that are really unique, who make only a few pieces a year, you need to be known as a collector. And what does that mean? It means that you support the art. It's no different than contemporary art, and you don't flip them. So flipping a watch, when you get a reputation for buying it at the entry price from the watchmaker and then turning around and selling it for 4 times that the next week, you're not a collector. You're just a flipper. And the watch community is very small. It's in terms of the makers, there's probably 25 makers of consequence worldwide. The word gets out overnight that you're not a real collector. And so it takes a long time to earn the trust of an F.P. Journe or a Simon Britt or any of these makers. And I'm known I've never sold a watch. And so I have a very vast collection, and I'm a dial guy, as you know. So
of course.
I'm always looking for the new dial. I'm wearing a
Yes,
Moser,
let's see.
a unique dial here. And of course, this is a classic Daytona. I thought, this is New York time, this is Abu Dhabi time. And so I support... The thing about getting into the business of retailing watches or retailing bands is all of a sudden...
I'd buy it, Kevin.
Yeah, no, I'm
100%.
You're no
I'll pay a
longer
penny
collector.
for an O'Leary band.
But I'm very fortunate. Every watch company knows I won't wear it unless it has a red band. So they don't even offer me watches if they can't put a red band on. I would never buy them. So my whole thing's red band because it looks fantastic. Great with gold, great with platinum. I mean, this looks gorgeous. Works with my red.
Of course.
I just wonder if
on Shark Tank.
Yeah, the whole thing is, you know, it's just over the years it's become one of my things. But each maker, watches are really a beautiful thing because they mark a period in your life. Every time I do a big deal, I buy a new watch, and I associate that deal with that watch. And, you know, my daughters try and steal them, my wife, my son. Nobody gets to touch my watches. Like, that's it. That's the one thing that I've got. They're in vaults all around the world, you know, and I just love it. I just have so much fun. And the reason I like it is the community of watch collectors that I know all around the world are very eclectic. Surgeons, artists, financiers, royalty, you name it. And
journalists?
Yes, journalists. We share the passion of watches, and I think it enriches my life.
Great. Kevin O'Leary, a millionaire investor, host of the Smash Hit Show at Shark Tank. Thank you so much for your time.
You got it. Thank you.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Honolulu, a journey that'll give you history, food trips, and adventure. But more than anything, Honolulu offers you nature at its best. One of the most famous is Waikiki, the beachfront neighborhood of Honolulu and the most touristy area in town. Occupying a long stretch of the coast on the south shore of Honolulu, Waikiki's got a strip of high-rise hotels and resorts lining the beach. Other famous spots on the historical side include the Lolani Palace, a historical landmark in downtown Honolulu, originally built in 1879. Pearl Harbor is also considered a memorial attraction in Honolulu. Meanwhile, the local Hawaiian cuisine is certainly a thing to try. Then there's a Honolulu's Chinatown for fresh produce. The busy market section of Honolulu smells of fresh fruits and veggies and meat and fish. Here you can buy produce at great prices. And finally, here are Honolulu's well-known nature trips. The Hanayuma Bay is one of the most famous places on the entire island for snorkeling. It's a nature reserve and marine sanctuary. Hiking is one of the best things to do in Honolulu. There are quite a few good hikes right in the Honolulu area. Some of them, a bit outside of the city limits, but others are just right in the city. Take your pick. Then, of course, there's the Diamond Head, which is the iconic former volcano that's an emblem of travelers visiting Honolulu. People often like to take photos with it as a backdrop, but the view is in fact so much better when you're on top of it. Then, there's the Manoa Falls that offers a lush green jungle hike. It's a good way to appreciate the greenery and plants and trees of Hawaii. The north shore of Oahu is also great for surfing, or try the bodyboard, stand-up paddleboard, and other ocean activities. And then there's the Honolulu Zoo that's home to 905 different animals. Along with the diversity of different animals at the Honolulu Zoo, also neatly designed with many different lush tropical gardens. And finally, the Waikiki Aquarium is a good place to learn about the marine life of Hawaii.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers,